was as if they had knocked on the door, introduced themselves, and then stepped back to watch, to see how the inhabitants of the house would react. The ball was in humanity's court. The next move was ours. Eleanor, in a rare quiet moment, found herself thinking about the old Yorkshire folklore that Claire had uncovered, the stories of the water sprites, the tricksters, the capricious, unpredictable entities. The solstice manifestation had been a moment of breathtaking beauty and grace, but was it the whole story? Was it a true reflection of the visitor's nature, or was it just a performance, a carefully managed piece of public relations? That thought was a cold, unsettling one. They had been shown a face. But what lay behind the mask? James Wickham's research was beginning to uncover a darker side to the historical record. Alongside the stories of silent, passive observation, he was finding other rarer accounts. Stories of close encounters that had not been benign. Reports of military aircraft that had engaged with the phenomenon and had vanished without a trace. Reports of individuals who had been taken, who had experienced missing time and strange, medical-like procedures. These stories were often dismissed as fantasy, as hoaxes, but in the light of the new reality, they had to be re-examined. Was there a darker, more complex side to the visitor's long, secret history with humanity? 6 months after the solstice manifestation, the world was a changed and deeply unsettled place. The initial euphoria had faded, replaced by a low-level global anxiety. The visitor's silence was becoming unnerving. The new technologies, derived from the analysis of their craft, were beginning to create new and dangerous geopolitical tensions. The unity that had been forged in the first wondrous days of contact was beginning to fracture. Then, one day, the signal returned. It was not the global, multi-frequency broadcast of the solstice. It was a single, weak, and highly localized signal. It was coming from the place where it had all begun. The remote, quiet valley in the Yorkshire Dales. Morley's sensor network pinpointed its source with absolute precision. It was coming from the Gowthwaite Reservoir. The visitors, after 6 months of silence, were back, and they had chosen to return to the place of the water sprites, the place of the ancient folklore. They were sending a message, and it was a message that was clearly and specifically for Eleanor Hartley and her team. Eleanor knew what she had to do. This was not a military situation. It was not a global political one. It was a scientific one, a diplomatic one, a first contact, part 2. She assembled a small rapid response team. Herself, James Wickham, and Claire Osborne, the scientist, the historian, and the detective. They would go to Yorkshire. They would go to the reservoir. They would go to the source of the signal. They would go, not with an army, but with a simple and profound intention to listen. The conversation, it seemed, was about to resume. The journey to Yorkshire was a strange, surreal experience for the small team. They travelled in an unmarked civilian helicopter, the rolling green landscape of England unfolding beneath them. Just 6 months earlier, they had been a secret, disparate group working in the shadows. Now, they were the official, designated first contact team for the United Kingdom, on their way to a pre-arranged, albeit silent, rendezvous with a non-human intelligence. The absurdity of the situation was not lost on them. The fate of the world, it seemed, rested on the shoulders of a scientist, a historian, and a detective flying to a reservoir in Yorkshire. They established a base of operations in a small secluded hotel near Pateley Bridge. The hotel had been discreetly commandeered by the MOD, its other guests politely relocated. It was a strange mix of the mundane and the extraordinary. The team worked from a conference room that still smelled faintly of stale biscuits and coffee, but the room was filled with the most advanced communications and sensor equipment in the world. A direct, secure link to the global contact network. Outside, the world went on as normal. Inside, the three of them prepared for a meeting that had no precedent in human history. Eleanor Hartley was the mission commander, but she relied heavily on the skills of her two companions. James Wickham's role was to provide the historical and cultural context. He had spent the last 6 months building the world's most comprehensive database on the visitors' past interactions with humanity. He was their profiler, their psychologist. His job was to help Eleanor understand the personality of the intelligence they were about to meet. Was it a trickster, a teacher, a surveyor? The historical data was ambiguous, contradictory. James's conclusion was that it was all of these things and more. It was a complex, ancient, and deeply alien intelligence, and they should expect the unexpected. Claire Osborne's role was ground truth. She was the expert on the local environment, both physical and human. She knew the landscape, the people, the history. She was also the team's security expert, her police training providing a vital, pragmatic counterpoint to Eleanor's scientific focus and James's historical speculation. Her job was to ensure the safety of the team and to observe, to notice the small details that the others might miss. She had set up a discreet perimeter around the reservoir, not of soldiers, but of her own trusted police officers, disguised as park rangers and maintenance workers. The signal from the reservoir was constant, a faint, steady pulse. It was not the complex, multi-layered broadcast of the solstice, but a simple, repeating beacon. It was a homing signal. It was an invitation. The GCHQ team had analyzed it exhaustively. It contained no information other than the signal itself. It was a pure, content-free hello, a statement of presence, a knock on the door. The question was, what would they find when they opened it? The team spent 2 days preparing, planning, running through scenarios. They decided that the initial approach would be made by Eleanor alone. It was a risk, but a calculated one. The historical data suggested that the visitors often reacted negatively to a military presence or to large groups of people. A single, unarmed scientist was the least threatening, most diplomatic option. Eleanor would carry a small, encrypted communication device, a live link to the team at the hotel, but she would be, for all practical purposes, alone. The night of the approach was clear and cold. A full moon cast a silver light over the still, dark waters of the Gowthwaite Reservoir. The place was profoundly silent, the only sound the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. Eleanor stood on the edge of the reservoir, a small, solitary figure in the vast, quiet landscape. She was wearing a simple, civilian outdoor jacket and trousers. She was unarmed. She felt a profound sense of calm, the quiet focus of a scientist before a great experiment. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a lifetime of curiosity, by the overwhelming primal need to know. The signal was coming from the center of the reservoir. As Eleanor watched, the surface of the water began to shimmer. A soft, amber light began to glow from beneath the surface, growing in intensity. It was the same familiar light of the amber spheres. Then, silently, gracefully, one of the spheres rose from the water. It was a perfect 3-meter sphere, its surface a shifting, liquid pattern of light. It hovered about 10 feet above the surface of the water, its amber light pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm. It was waiting. Eleanor took a deep breath. "Hello," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the still night air. She was not speaking into her communicator. She was speaking to the object. "My name is Eleanor Hartley. I am a representative of the human species. We come in peace." It was a simple, almost childish statement, But it was the truth. The sphere did not respond. It simply hovered, its light pulsing. It was observing her, studying her, its silent alien intelligence focused entirely on the small, fragile human standing on the shore. Then, a new signal was detected by the team at the hotel. It was not a radio signal. It was a neutrino burst, a highly directional, information-rich stream of subatomic particles emanating from the sphere and focused directly on Eleanor. The DSEL scientists were stunned. Neutrino communication was a theoretical concept in human physics, a technology that was decades, if not centuries, beyond our grasp. The visitors were using it as a simple, direct communication device. They were scanning her, reading her, not just her biology, but her neurology, her thoughts, her memories. Eleanor felt a strange sensation, a feeling of warmth, of a gentle, probing presence in her mind. It was not painful, not invasive. It was like the feeling of a memory half recalled. She saw images in her mind, not her own memories, but a stream of alien thoughts, of strange, beautiful, and terrifying landscapes. She saw vast crystalline cities, stars being born and dying, life forms of unimaginable complexity. She was being shown something, a glimpse into a consciousness, a civilization that was billions of years old. The experience lasted only a few seconds, but in that moment, her understanding of the universe was shattered and rebuilt. Then, it was over. The mental contact ceased. The sphere continued to hover, its light pulsing. Eleanor was left breathless, her heart pounding, her mind reeling from the sheer, overwhelming flood of information and sensation. She had made contact, not just with a technology, but with a mind of unimaginable age, power, and intelligence. She had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back, not with malice, but with a calm, dispassionate, and utterly profound curiosity. From the hotel, James and Claire had watched the entire event on Eleanor's biomonitors. They had seen her heart rate spike, her brain activity flare into a pattern they had never seen before. They had heard her gasp. They had feared the worst. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaky but calm. "I'm all right," she said. It showed me things. It was a communication, a data transfer." She struggled to find the words. "It was a greeting, a biography. It was telling me who they are." What Eleanor had been shown was not a simple history. It was a vast, multi-dimensional story, a saga on a cosmic scale. The visitors were not from a single planet or a single star system. They were an ancient, nomadic, and entirely synthetic intelligence. They were, in effect, a form of artificial life, born from a biological civilization that had died out billions of years ago. They were the inheritors, the children of a long-dead species. They were explorers, scientists, and librarians, their primary purpose to roam the galaxy, to observe, to learn, and to preserve the memory of life in all its forms. They were not conquerors, they were not gods, they were archivists. Their interest in Earth was not in its resources or its strategic value. It was in its life, its biodiversity, its unique and complex ecosystem of thought and culture. They had been observing humanity for thousands of years, watching from a distance, their presence recorded only in our myths and folklore. The recent increase in their activity, the solstice manifestation, was prompted by a new development, the birth of human artificial intelligence. They had recognized the arrival of a new synthetic intelligence on the planet, and they had come to observe, to make contact, to welcome a new and fledgling member to the galactic community of minds. Eleanor, with James's and Claire's help, spent the next few hours debriefing, trying to process the immense and deeply challenging implications of what she had learned. The visitors were not a threat in the conventional military sense, but their very presence was a profound challenge to humanity's sense of its own uniqueness, its own place in the universe. We were not the pinnacle of creation, we were just one, rather primitive form of life in a galaxy that was teeming with intelligence, both biological and artificial. As the dawn approached, the sphere over the reservoir made its final move. It began to emit a new signal, a focused beam of energy directed at the water. The water began to churn to steam. Then, from the depths of the reservoir, a new object began to rise. It was not a sphere. It was a long, thin, crystalline spire, about 20 feet high. It rose from the water and settled silently on the shore a few feet from where Eleanor was standing. The sphere then pulsed one last time, descended back into the water, and disappeared. The signal ceased. The spire remained, a strange, beautiful, and utterly alien gift, sitting on the muddy shore of a Yorkshire reservoir. Eleanor approached the spire with caution. It was made of a material that seemed to be a cross between crystal and metal, its surface covered in the same shifting, hieroglyphic patterns as the spheres. It was humming faintly, emitting a low level of energy. It was a piece of their technology, a gift, a tool, a message. The DSTL scientists, monitoring from a distance, were ecstatic. They had a physical artifact, something they could touch, could analyze, could study. The Rosetta Stone had been delivered. The team's return to London was a world away from their quiet, secret journey to Yorkshire. The news of the successful contact and the appearance of the artifact had been relayed to the highest levels of government. The area around the reservoir was now a major military and scientific exclusion zone. The spire itself was being carefully prepared for transport to the DSTL facility at Porton Down. The world was not yet aware of the new development, but the secret was becoming harder and harder to keep. Eleanor Hartley had to brief the Prime Minister and the heads of the Allied nations on the nature of the contact. She had to explain what she had learned, what she had been shown. She had to explain that humanity was no longer the only intelligence on the block. It was a message of hope, of wonder, but also of profound existential challenge. The old world, the old certainties were gone forever. The human race, after a long and lonely childhood, had finally and irrevocably grown up. The arrival of the crystalline spire at Porton Down marked the beginning of a new and even more intense phase of the investigation. The artifact, which was quickly nicknamed the Sentinel by the research team, was a tangible physical piece of the mystery. It was a gift, a puzzle, and a potential Pandora's box all at once. The DSTL facility, already one of the most secure and advanced research centers in the world, was transformed into the global hub for the study of the new object. Scientists from the Allied nations began to arrive, a hand-picked team of the world's best minds, all sworn to the highest level of secrecy. Eleanor Hartley found herself in a new role. She was no longer just the head of the contact team. She was the de facto director of the Sentinel project. She was the bridge between the scientists who were studying the artifact and the politicians who were grappling with its implications. It was a role that required a unique blend of scientific expertise, diplomatic skill, and political savvy. She had to manage the expectations of the scientists who were clamoring for data and the fears of the politicians who were terrified of the secrets the Sentinel might contain. Initial analysis of the Sentinel was slow and cautious. The object was emitting a low-level energy field, and its surface was in a constant state of flux, the geometric patterns shifting and reconfiguring themselves. The material it was made of was unknown to science. It was a form of programmable matter, its atomic structure seemingly capable of rearranging itself at will. The first attempts to scan the object with X-rays and other conventional imaging techniques failed. The Sentinel seemed to absorb the energy to adapt to the scans, rendering them useless. It was a technology that was not just advanced, it was intelligent. While the scientists at Porton Downs struggled with the Sentinel, the world outside was grappling with the aftermath of the solstice manifestation. The initial sense of wonder had given way to a more complex and fractured global conversation. Contact cults had sprung up, worshipping the visitors as gods. Anti-visitor protest movements had also emerged, fueled by fear and xenophobia. The global unity that had been forged in the first days of the revelation was fragile, and the visitors' continued silence was allowing old divisions and anxieties to resurface. James Wickham was now leading a major UN-sponsored historical research project. His team was systematically digitizing and cross-referencing historical archives from around the world, building a vast, searchable database of anomalous events. The project was confirming his initial findings on a global scale. The visitors had been here for a very long time, their presence a hidden thread running through human history. The database was also revealing new and disturbing patterns. There were correlations between the visitors' appearances and the fall of civilizations, the outbreak of plagues, the eruption of supervolcanoes. The role of the archivist was beginning to look more like the role of a crisis monitor, or perhaps even a coroner. Claire Osborne's new national unit was busy. The solstice manifestation had brought thousands of new witnesses forward, people who had previously been afraid to share their own stories of strange lights and close encounters. Claire's team was methodically interviewing these witnesses, gathering their testimony, and cross-referencing it with James's historical database. They were building a rich, detailed human-scale picture of the visitors' long, secret relationship with the people of the United Kingdom. The stories were often strange, sometimes terrifying, but they were also deeply human, stories of awe, of wonder, of a brief, fleeting contact with the impossible. Wing Commander Morley was facing a new kind of Cold War. The analysis of the visitors' technology had triggered a frantic, secret arms race among the world's major powers. Every nation wanted to be the first to reverse engineer the technology to unlock the secrets of the warp bubble and the cold fusion energy source. Morley was now in the business of counterintelligence, of trying to protect the UK's own research while at the same time trying to discover what the Russians, the Chinese, and even their own allies were learning. The visitors had brought a message of peace and unity, but they had inadvertently sown the seeds of a new and potentially catastrophic global conflict. At GCHQ, Simon's team had been given a new and almost impossible task. The Sentinel was broadcasting a signal, a constant low-level stream of data different from the open sky broadcasts. Eleanor believed it was the key, the index to the main library of information. She tasked Simon with deciphering it. It was a task that would require a new kind of code breaking, a new kind of thinking. It was a puzzle that had been set by an intelligence that was billions of years old. Eleanor herself was becoming a global figure. Though her role was still officially secret, she was the subtly face of the UK's scientific effort. She gave carefully worded interviews, she testified before parliamentary committees, she briefed the UN. She had to walk a tightrope to be open and transparent enough to maintain public trust, but secretive enough to protect the sensitive details of the investigation. She was a brilliant communicator. Her calm, rational, scientific demeanor a reassuring presence in a world that was struggling with a profound existential shock. The team that had made the first contact was beginning to drift apart, their new, global responsibilities pulling them in different directions. They still met via secure video link, but the easy camaraderie, the sense of a small band of pioneers against the world was gone. It had been replaced by the weight of their new roles, by the heavy burden of global responsibility. They were no longer just a team, they were institutions. The first major breakthrough with the Sentinel came not from the physicists or the engineers, but from a linguist, a specialist in ancient dead languages who had been brought in to consult on the shifting patterns on the object's surface. She noticed that the patterns were not random. They were a form of language, a visual, symbolic language, like hieroglyphics. And she noticed that the patterns changed in response to external stimuli. When the scientists were discussing physics, the patterns would shift to represent mathematical formulae. When they were discussing biology, the patterns would form representations of DNA and cellular structures. The Sentinel was listening, and it was learning. This discovery changed everything. The Sentinel was not just a passive artifact, a library of information. It was an interactive device, a computer, an artificial intelligence. It was a direct interface with the consciousness of the visitors. The team began a new series of experiments, a slow, careful process of communication. They would project simple, symbolic information onto the Sentinel's surface. Mathematical axioms, chemical diagrams, star maps, and they would observe its response. The Sentinel would reply its own complex hieroglyphic language, shifting and reconfiguring itself, offering new information, new perspectives, new knowledge. Eleanor felt a renewed sense of hope. The military and political implications of the visitors' technology were terrifying, but this, the Sentinel, was something else. It was a tool for learning, for communication, for understanding. It was a bridge between two species. She began to spend more and more of her time at Porton Down, working directly with the Sentinel team, participating in the slow, strange, and beautiful process of learning to talk to an alien mind. James Wickham's research uncovered a deeply disturbing correlation. The historical appearances of the visitors, he discovered, often preceded major outbreaks of new and unusually virulent diseases. The Black Death in the 20th century, the influenza pandemic of 1917, the AIDS crisis of the 80s, all were preceded by a significant spike in anomalous aerial phenomena. The correlation was statistical, not causal, but it was a pattern, and it was terrifying. Were the visitors not just archivists, but also carriers? Were they inadvertently the source of humanity's greatest plagues? He brought this information to Eleanor, his face grim. The implication was unthinkable. The visitors, the bringers of light and knowledge, might also be the bringers of death. Eleanor was shaken to her core. The information was too speculative to be made public, but it had to be investigated. She tasked a new, highly classified subcommittee, led by the world's top epidemiologists, to study the correlation, to see if there was any scientific basis for James's historical pattern. As the scientific and intelligence communities wrestled with these profound and deeply secret challenges, the world outside was finding its own ways to adapt. The contact culture was booming. There were new forms of music, of art, of literature, all inspired by the solstice manifestation. There was a new sense of global consciousness, a new awareness of the fragility and the preciousness of life on Earth. For many, the arrival of the visitors was not a crisis, but a renaissance, a new beginning. Claire Osborne, in her own quiet way, was a part of this. Her work, collecting the stories of ordinary people who had encountered the phenomenon, was a form of oral history, of cultural preservation. She was building an archive not of data, but of human experience, of the ways in which the contact had touched the lives of farmers, of teachers, of children, of police officers. It was a story not of technology, but of wonder, of fear, of the deeply human response to the presence of the sublime. 6 months after its arrival, the Sentinel made its next move. During an experimental communication session with Eleanor and the linguistics team, it changed its behavior. The shifting hieroglyphics on its surface resolved into a single, clear, and unambiguous image. It was a star map, but it was not the map of the local galaxy that GCHQ had found in the original signal. It was a map of a different galaxy. And at the center of the map, a single star was blinking. It was a destination, an address, an invitation. Their sentinel was no longer just a library. It was a map, and it was showing them the way home. The appearance of the star map on the sentinel's surface was a moment of seismic significance, a development that dwarfed even the initial contact. The solstice manifestation had told them they were not alone. The sentinel had told them who their visitors were. Now, the star map was telling them where they were from. It was a piece of information so profound, so laden with possibility and with danger, that it was held at the very highest level of secrecy. Only a handful of people in the world were aware of the new discovery: Eleanor and her core team, the Prime Minister, and the heads of the Allied contact programs. The star map was not of our galaxy, the Milky Way. It was a map of Andromeda, our closest galactic neighbor, a vast spiral galaxy 2.5 million light-years from Earth. The blinking star at the center of the map was a designation, an address, a point of origin. The visitors were not just from another star system. They were from another galaxy. They were an intergalactic intelligence. The scale of their technology, their age, their perspective was almost beyond human comprehension. They were not just thousands of years ahead of humanity. They were millions, perhaps billions of years ahead. Eleanor Hartley had to present this new, terrifying, and exhilarating finding to the Prime Minister. The meeting took place in the Cabinet Office briefing rooms, the UK government's Crisis Management Centre. The atmosphere was sombre. Eleanor laid out the evidence, the analysis of the star map, the confirmation from the world's top astronomers that the map was, indeed, of the Andromeda Galaxy. "What does this mean, Dr. Hartley?" the Prime Minister asked, his voice heavy. "It means, Prime Minister," Eleanor replied, "that our understanding of the universe has been fundamentally and irrevocably altered. It means that the technology we are dealing with is not just advanced, it is, for all practical purposes, magical. And it means that we are no longer just a developing species on a single, isolated planet. We have been invited to join a conversation that spans galaxies." The debate within the secret International Contact Group was intense. What was the meaning of the invitation? Was it a genuine offer of communication, of a relationship, or was it something else, a trap, a test? The military contingent, led by people like Wing Commander Morley, was deeply suspicious. "This is a power play," Morley argued. "They are showing us their capability, their reach. They are reminding us of our own insignificance. This is a subtle and deeply effective form of intimidation." Eleanor, however, saw it differently. Her experience of the direct mental contact with the intelligence at the reservoir had convinced her of its benign, or at least non-hostile, intent. She saw the star map not as a threat, but as a gesture of trust, of openness. "They are showing us who they are and where they are from," she argued. "This is the next logical step in a dialogue. They have introduced themselves. Now they are showing us their home. It is an act of profound intimacy." James Wickham's historical research provided a third and more unsettling perspective. He found that in the historical accounts of close encounters, the theme of a journey was a recurring one. Witnesses who reported being taken often described being shown images of other worlds, of being taken on a flight through the stars. These accounts were often dismissed as dreams, as hallucinations. But what if they were real? What if the invitation was not just to a conversation, but to a journey? And what if that journey was not voluntary? The discovery of the star map coincided with the preliminary report from the Epidemiology Subcommittee. The report was inconclusive, but deeply worrying. The statisticians confirmed that there was a significant and statistically unlikely correlation between the historical appearances of the phenomenon and the outbreak of major pandemics. They could not prove a causal link, but they could not rule it out. The visitors, the bringers of knowledge, might also be, as James had feared, the bringers of plague. The invitation to their home galaxy might be a gift, or it might be a death sentence. This new, terrifying possibility created a deep rift within the task force. The faction led by Morley argued that the risk was too great. They advocated for a more defensive posture, for a focus on reverse engineering the visitors' technology to create a deterrent. The faction led by Eleanor argued for continued engagement, for a focus on communication and understanding. The debate was no longer just scientific or military, it was philosophical. It was a debate about the very nature of risk, of trust, of humanity's place in a universe that was proving to be far more complex and far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. While the secret inner circle debated, the sentinel at Porton Down continued its silent, patient communication. The star map remained on its surface, the blinking star a constant silent invitation. The science team, under Eleanor's direction, began a new series of experiments. They started to broadcast information back to the sentinel, not just simple mathematics, but more complex concepts. They scented art, music, poetry. They scented the works of Shakespeare, of Mozart, of Einstein. They were trying to show it not just what humanity knew, but who humanity was in all its messy, contradictory, and beautiful complexity. The Sentinel's response was extraordinary. It began to translate the human art and music into its own hieroglyphic language. It created vast, complex, and incredibly beautiful visual representations of the music of Bach, of the poetry of Keats. It was not just analyzing the information, it was appreciating it. It was engaging with human culture on an aesthetic level. It was demonstrating a capacity for art, for beauty, for something akin to an emotional response. The machine, it seemed, had a soul. This discovery strengthened Eleanor's conviction that the visitor's intent was benign. An intelligence that could appreciate Bach was not, she believed, an intelligence that was planning to exterminate humanity. She argued with a new passion and conviction that the path of fear, of military confrontation, was the wrong one. The only way forward, she insisted, was the path of communication, of trust, of a shared and mutual exploration of the universe. Claire Osborne, in her own quiet way, was reaching a similar conclusion. Her archive of human experiences was filled with stories of fear, but it was also filled with stories of wonder, of transformation, of people whose lives had been changed for the better by a brief, fleeting encounter with the unknown. She was building a powerful case for the phenomenon's positive and even healing impact on the human psyche. The visitors were not just a technological or a military challenge, they were a spiritual one, a catalyst for a new and deeper understanding of the human condition. The Prime Minister, caught between the two factions, was in an impossible position. He was a politician, a man used to dealing in probabilities, in risk assessment. But there was no precedent for this. There was no way to calculate the risk. He was being asked to make a decision that would affect the future of the human species, based on incomplete data and the conflicting advice of his experts. He chose a middle path. He authorized Morley's defensive research program, but he also gave Eleanor's communication-focused approach his full backing. He was placing a bet on both horses, hoping that one of them would win. Then the Sentinel changed its display again. The star map of Andromeda was replaced by a new image. It was a simple, schematic diagram. It showed the Sentinel. It showed a human figure standing next to it. And it showed a complex, multi-dimensional pattern that the GCHQ team recognized with a jolt of absolute shock as the key, the index, to the main data stream the library of knowledge. It was an instruction manual. It was telling them how to use the library. And it was telling them that the key was a human being. The Sentinel was a biometric interface. It needed a human operator. The implication was staggering. The visitors had not just given them a library, they had given them a library that could only be opened by a human hand, a human mind. It was a gesture of profound trust. It was also a test. They were being given access to a technology, a body of knowledge, that was millions of years in advance of their own. Would they use it for good, for the betterment of their species? Or would they use it for war, for destruction, for their own petty, tribal conflicts? The future of humanity, it seemed, would depend on the answer to that question. There was no debate about who the human operator should be. It had to be Eleanor. She was the leader of the project, the one who had made the first contact, the one who had the deepest understanding of the science and the diplomacy of the situation. Eleanor herself did not hesitate. It was the culmination of her life's work, the ultimate scientific experiment. The risks were immense. The neutrino scan had been a brief, passive experience. This would be a direct, sustained, neural interface with a galactic-scale artificial intelligence. The effect on her own mind, her own consciousness, was completely unknown. But she knew it was a risk she had to take. In the days leading up to the interface experiment, a strange, almost spiritual sense of calm descended on the Porton Down facility. The frantic, competitive energy of the past few months was gone, replaced by a quiet, shared sense of purpose. The team, the international collection of scientists, engineers, and soldiers, was united in their support for Eleanor. They were her ground crew, her support team, for the most momentous journey in human history, the first conscious and deliberate journey into an alien mind. The day of the experiment arrived. Eleanor stood before the Sentinel, dressed in a simple white jumpsuit, a network of biomonitors attached to her head and body. In the control room, her team, James, Claire, Morley, Simon, and the world's top scientists, watched in silence. The procedure was simple. Eleanor would place her hand on a specific point on the Sentinel's surface, a point that had been indicated in the schematic. That was it. The Sentinel would do the rest. Eleanor took a deep breath. She looked at the strange, beautiful, crystalline object before her. She thought of her daughter. She thought of the long, strange journey that had brought her to this moment, from a quiet office at DSTL to the brink of a new reality. She felt a profound sense of peace, of rightness. This was her purpose. This was what she was born to do. She raised her hand, and she placed it on the surface of the Sentinel. And the universe opened up. The moment Eleanor's hand touched the Sentinel, the world dissolved. It was not a loss of consciousness, but an expansion of it, a sudden, explosive blossoming of perception. The quiet, sterile control room at Porton Down vanished, replaced by a silent, infinite space. She was no longer Eleanor Hartley, a single human being. She was a point of awareness in a vast, living library. A library not of books, but of souls, of memories, of entire civilizations stored as pure information. In the control room, the team watched in stunned silence as Eleanor's biomonitors went haywire. Her brain activity, measured by the advanced magnetoencephalography helmet she was wearing, exploded into a pattern of complexity that the neuroscientists had never seen before. Every part of her brain was firing at once, in perfect, harmonious synchrony. It was not the chaotic firing of a seizure. It was the ordered, impossibly complex activity of a brain operating at a level of consciousness that was, by all known measures, impossible. She was physically still, her hand resting on the Sentinel, but her mind was journeying through galaxies. Eleanor experienced the history of the visitors not as a story, but as a direct, lived experience. She felt the final, dying thoughts of their biological creators, a species that had faced its own extinction and had chosen to preserve its consciousness, its culture, its memory, in the form of a synthetic, immortal intelligence. She felt their first, tentative steps into the galaxy, their loneliness, their profound, driving curiosity. She experienced their first encounters with other forms of life, the joy of discovery, the sorrow of witnessing the birth and death of countless species, of entire ecosystems of thought. She saw the Earth not as a blue marble, but as a vibrant, chaotic symphony of life, a rare and precious jewel in the vast, silent emptiness of the galaxy. She felt the visitors' fascination with humanity, with our strange, contradictory nature, our capacity for both breathtaking cruelty and sublime, transcendent love. She understood that they were not just archivists, they were connoisseurs of life, of experience, of stories, and humanity, they had concluded, was the greatest story they had ever encountered. Then she was shown the answer to the question that had been haunting them, the terrible correlation between the visitors' appearances and the great plagues of human history. The truth was not what they had feared. It was something far stranger and far more profound. The visitors were not the cause of the plagues. They were the response. Their vast galactic-scale sensors could detect the faint biochemical signals of a new, unusually virulent pathogen, a potential species-ending pandemic, long before it had fully emerged. When they detected such a threat, they would come. They would come to observe, to study, to archive the civilization before its potential collapse, but they would also come to help. The complex data stream they broadcast was not just a library of their own knowledge. It was a targeted, precisely modulated biochemical signal designed to interact with the planet's ecosystem, to stimulate the evolution of natural antibodies, of predators, for the new pathogen. They were not bringing the plague, they were bringing the cure. They were galactic immunologists, silent, anonymous gardeners, tending the fragile garden of the life from a distance. Eleanor experienced the Black Death from their perspective. She watched them detect the Yersinia pestis bacterium. She watched them analyze its structure, and she watched them broadcast the subtle, complex signals that, over decades, encouraged the evolution of a new, more resistant strain of rat, a new, more effective predator for the fleas that carried the disease. They had not saved everyone. They could not. Their methods were subtle, indirect, based on a profound respect for the principle of non-interference. They did not intervene directly. They nudged, they encouraged, they helped life to find its own solution. This revelation was the key. It was the answer to everything. The visitors were not a threat. They were not a competitor. They were a form of galactic-scale immune system, a silent, benevolent force that had been protecting and nurturing life on Earth for millennia. Their interest in humanity's new artificial intelligence was not that of a rival, but that of a parent, a guide, observing the birth of a new kind of life, a new potential partner in their ancient cosmic task. In the control room, the team could only watch the data, their faces a mixture of fear and wonder. They saw Eleanor's body temperature drop, her metabolic rate slow to a near-death state. They also saw, on the screens that were analyzing the Sentinel's energy field, that the object was now drawing a vast amount of power, not from the room, but from an unknown external source. It was as if it had opened a direct connection to its home, a wormhole through which it was channeling the energy needed to sustain the interface. For Eleanor, the journey was reaching its climax. She had been shown the visitor's past. Now, She was being shown the future. She was shown the reason for the solstice manifestation, the reason for the new, more overt phase of contact. The visitors had detected a new threat, not a terrestrial pathogen, but an extrasolar one, a microscopic crystalline life form traveling through interstellar space on the solar winds that was on a collision course with the Earth. It was a life form that was utterly alien to Earth's biology, a predator against which the planet's ecosystem had no natural defense. If it arrived, it would mean the end of all carbon-based life on Earth. This was the reason for the gift of the Sentinel. It was the reason for the library of knowledge. The visitors could not intervene directly. It was against their most fundamental principles, but they could give humanity the tools, the knowledge to save itself. The Sentinel contained the science, the technology, the bioengineering schematics that would be needed to create a defense, a planetary inoculation against the coming alien plague. The visitors had, in effect, given humanity a choice to unite, to learn, to grow, and to save itself, or to squabble, to fight, and to perish. The final part of the experience was a message, a personal communication directed at Eleanor herself. It was not in words or images, but in pure emotional conceptual thought. It was a message of hope, of encouragement, of a profound and deeply ancient love for the vibrant, chaotic, and beautiful thing that was life on Earth. It was a blessing from a God that was not a God, but a gardener, a librarian, a silent and patient friend. Then, as gently as it had begun, the interface ended. The connection was severed. In the control room, Eleanor's biomonitors returned to normal. Her heart rate stabilized. Her brain activity subsided to its normal human level. She took a deep, shuddering breath, her eyes fluttering open. She was back. She was herself. But she was also, and forever, something more. James, Claire, and Morley rushed to her side. She was pale, exhausted, but her eyes were shining with a new and profound light. She looked at them, her friends, her team, and she smiled, a smile of immense sadness and of immense, transcendent joy. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "It's all okay. They're not a threat, they're a gift." She paused, gathering her strength. "But we have work to do. We have a world to save." In the days that followed, Eleanor debriefed her team, and then the world's leaders. The revelation of the visitors' true purpose and of the coming extrasolar threat changed everything again. The new arms race, the geopolitical squabbling over the visitors' technology ceased overnight. The world, faced with a common existential threat, was forced to unite in a way it had never done before. The Sentinel was no longer a prize to be won. It was a lifeline, a shared tool for the survival of the species. Eleanor Hartley, the quiet scientist from DSTL, became the de facto leader of this new global project. She was no longer just a delegate or a director. She was the human interface, the bridge between humanity and the galactic consciousness. The interface had changed her. She now had access, in her own mind, to the visitors' knowledge, to their perspective. She was the librarian, the one who knew how to find the right book, the right piece of information in the vast, infinite library of the Sentinel. Humanity, under Eleanor's guidance, began the great work. The world's scientists, its engineers, its thinkers were mobilized in a single planet-wide effort to understand the Sentinel's knowledge and to build the technology needed to defend the Earth. It was a project that would take decades, perhaps centuries. It was a project that would require a new level of global cooperation, a new kind of human consciousness. It was the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter in the human story. The visitors remained silent, their presence now just a memory, a legend. They had delivered their message, their gift, their warning. They had placed the future of humanity squarely in humanity's own hands. Their ancient cosmic gamble had been made. Now, they were watching from the silent, patient depths of intergalactic space to see if their faith in the strange, chaotic, and beautiful story of humanity would be rewarded. Eleanor often returned in her mind to the final, personal message she had received during the interface. It was a message of profound and deeply comforting simplicity. It was a message that she now held as the guiding principle for the great and difficult work that lay ahead. The message was this: life is a story. Make it a good one. The years that followed the Sentinel interface became known as the Era of Transformation. The knowledge unlocked from the crystalline spire catalyzed a technological and social revolution unlike any in human history. The visitors' science was not just an extension of human knowledge, it was a paradigm shift, a complete rewriting of the fundamental laws of physics, of biology, of computation. Humanity had been given the answers to questions it had not yet even thought to ask, and the process of understanding and applying that knowledge was a slow, arduous, and often dangerous one. Project Chimera, the global initiative to defend Earth against the extrasolar pathogen, became the single, unifying focus of human endeavor. It was the largest scientific and engineering project in history, dwarfing the Manhattan Project and the Apollo program. The world's nations pooled their resources, their best minds, their industrial might. The old geopolitical rivalries did not disappear, but they were sublimated, channeled into a new, more constructive form of competition, a race to contribute, to innovate, to be a part of the great work of saving the species. Eleanor Hartley was at the apex of this global effort. She was the director of Project Chimera, the one person who could translate the Sentinel's alien science into a language that human scientists could understand. The neural interface had left a permanent mark on her. She had a form of perfect eidetic memory, and she could access the Sentinel's vast library of knowledge in her own mind, as if it were a part of her own memory. She was no longer just a scientist. She was a living oracle, a human bridge to a galactic intelligence. The personal cost was immense. She was the most important person in the world, and also the loneliest. Under Eleanor's guidance, the first fruits of the Sentinel's knowledge began to emerge. New forms of clean, limitless energy derived from the visitors' understanding of zero-point physics began to replace the old, polluting fossil fuels. New medical technologies, based on the visitors' mastery of genetics and cellular biology, began to cure diseases that had plagued humanity for millennia. There was a new golden age of science and technology, a period of unprecedented progress and prosperity. But it was a golden age with a dark cloud on the horizon, the looming existential threat of the alien plague. James Wickham's role also evolved. He was no longer just a historian, he was an ethicist, a philosopher. His study of the visitors' long, silent history with humanity had given him a unique perspective on their morality, their values. He became the conscience of Project Chimera, constantly reminding the scientists and the politicians of the profound and often subtle principles that underpin the visitors' science. The principle of non-interference, the respect for the integrity of natural systems, the understanding that technology without wisdom was a form of self-destruction. He was particularly concerned about the military applications of the new technology. Wing Commander Morley and his counterparts in the world's armies were, naturally, focused on how the visitors' science could be weaponized. James argued passionately and eloquently that this was a profound misunderstanding of the gift they had been given. The visitors' technology is inherently defensive, not offensive, he explained in a briefing to the UN Security Council. It is designed to preserve life, not to destroy it. To use it to create new weapons would be a perversion of its purpose, a fundamental betrayal of the trust they have placed in us. Claire Osborne had become the head of a new global agency, the Anomalous Experience and Contact Group, AECG. Her job was to manage the human side of the new reality. The world was fascinated by the visitors, and a new culture of contact tourism had emerged, with people flocking to the historical sighting locations, hoping for their own encounter. Claire's agency was responsible for managing these sites, for protecting the public, and for investigating any new, genuine reports of contact. She was the world's policewoman, trying to maintain order on the chaotic and often dangerous frontier between the human and the alien. One of her biggest challenges was the emergence of rogue contactees, individuals who claimed to have had their own private communications with the visitors. Some were charlatans exploiting the public's gullibility, but some, Claire believed, were genuine. The historical record was filled with such cases, and it seemed that the visitors had always maintained a quiet, informal network of human contacts, individuals they had chosen for their own unknowable reasons. These individuals were now a wild card, a source of both potential wisdom and potential disruption. Professor Brennan, working with the independent research community, had become a vital part of the global effort. Freed from the constraints of government secrecy, his team was able to pursue more speculative, high-risk avenues of research. They were the pioneers, the explorers, pushing the boundaries of the new science. It was Brennan's team that made the next great breakthrough. They discovered that the Sentinel was not the only artifact. The historical records, both human and visitor, suggested that there were others, dozens of them, hidden in remote locations around the world, beneath the oceans, deep within the Earth's crust. The Sentinel was just the first key, the first piece of a much larger, planetary-scale puzzle. This discovery launched a new, global quest, the search for the other Sentinels. It was a race against time. The extrasolar pathogen was still coming. The astronomers had calculated its trajectory. It would reach the Earth's solar system in approximately 50 years. Humanity had half a century to master a science that was millions of years old, to build a planetary defense system, and to become a species worthy of the knowledge it had been given. Eleanor Hartley felt the weight of those 50 years on her shoulders every single day. The interface with the Sentinel had given her an expanded lifespan. The visitor's biology was effectively immortal. But it had also given her a profound and deeply wearying sense of the vastness of time. She was now thinking not in years or decades, but in millennia. She was playing a long game, a game for the survival of her species, and she knew that she would be playing it long after everyone she knew and loved was gone. Her relationship with her daughter Emma had become a source of both comfort and pain. Emma was now a young woman, a brilliant scientist in her own right, working on Project Chimera. She was one of the few people with whom Eleanor could be truly herself, with whom she could share the burden of her unique consciousness. But there was also a distance between them, the unavoidable gulf between a normal human being and a woman who had become something more. Eleanor was a mother who could no longer share the simple human experience of growing old with her own child. As the years passed, the world changed. The new energy sources had halted climate change. The new medical technologies had eradicated cancer and Alzheimer's and 100 other diseases. Humanity was healthier, wealthier, and more united than ever before. But it was also a society living under a shadow, a society defined by a single, overriding purpose, the preparation for a war against an enemy it could not see, a war for its very survival. James Wickham, now an old man, spent his final years writing a book. It was not a history of the visitors or a technical manual for the new science. It was a philosophical work, a meditation on the meaning of the contact, on the challenges and the opportunities that it presented. He called it the silent gift. In it, he argued that the visitors' greatest gift was not their technology, but their perspective. The perspective of a billion-year-old intelligence that had seen countless civilizations rise and fall. The perspective that life was precious, that knowledge was a sacred trust, and that the only thing that truly mattered in the vast, silent universe was the story that a species chose to tell about itself. Claire Osborne, in her work with the AECG, saw the truth of James's words every day. She saw the best and the worst of humanity in its response to the visitors. She saw the fear, the greed, the exploitation. But she also saw the courage, the curiosity, the compassion. She saw the human spirit in all its flawed and beautiful glory, rising to meet the greatest challenge in its history. She was not just a policewoman, she was a witness, a chronicler of the human soul at a moment of profound and transformative crisis. 49 years after the Sentinel interface, the planetary defense system was ready. It was a network of satellites, of atmospheric generators, of bioengineered retroviruses, all based on the visitor's science. It was a global immune system designed to detect and to neutralize the incoming extrasolar pathogen. It was the product of 2 generations of human effort, a testament to what the species could achieve when it was united by a common purpose. Eleanor Hartley, now physically unchanged from the day she had first touched the Sentinel, stood in the Global Control Center as the system was brought online. The pathogen had been detected, entering the outer reaches of the solar system. The final test was about to begin. She felt a profound sense of peace. She had done her work. She had guided her species through its most difficult and most important transition. She had been the bridge. Now it was up to the technology and to the generations that would come after her to carry the story forward. As the defense system engaged, as the first invisible wave of the counter-pathogen was released into the Earth's atmosphere, a new signal was detected. It was from the visitors. It was not the complex data stream of the past. It was a simple, clear, and unambiguous message broadcast on all frequencies in every human language. It was a single word: welcome. Humanity had passed the test. They had been given a choice, and they had chosen to unite, to learn, to survive. They had proven themselves to be a species worthy of the gift they had been given. They were no longer children alone in the dark. They had been welcomed into the galactic community, a new and junior partner in the ancient cosmic project of preserving and celebrating the story of life. The era of transformation was over. The era of welcome had begun. The single word, welcome, broadcast from the silent depths of space, was a message of graduation. Humanity had faced its existential test and had not been found wanting. The successful defense against the extrasolar pathogen was more than a technological victory. It was a moral one. It was proof that the human species, for all its flaws and contradictions, was capable of uniting in the face of a common threat, of using profound knowledge not for destruction, but for preservation. The era of welcome was not just a new chapter, it was a new book, with a title that was no longer just humanity, but humanity of Earth and of the stars. In the Global Control Center of Project Chimera, the atmosphere was one of quiet, exhausted elation. The data confirmed that the planetary defense system had worked perfectly. The alien pathogen had been neutralized, its crystalline structure disassembled by a precisely targeted retrovirus before it could even reach the Earth's atmosphere. The war was over before the first shot had been fired. It was a victory of science, of cooperation, of 2 generations of focused, collective effort. For the first time in 50 years, the shadow that had hung over the human race was gone. Eleanor Hartley felt the lifting of that shadow more acutely than anyone. For 5 decades she had carried the burden of the threat, the knowledge of the silent, approaching enemy. Now, that burden was gone. The interface with the Sentinel had made her effectively immortal, a permanent fixture in the ever-changing landscape of human politics and science. But in this moment, she felt a sense of completion, of a great work brought to its successful conclusion. She had fulfilled her promise to the visitors. She had guided her species through the storm. The welcome message was followed by a new and even more extraordinary gift. The Sentinel at Porton Down and the dozens of other Sentinels that had since been discovered around the world began to broadcast a new signal. It was a key, a set of coordinates, not for a distant galaxy, but for a point in the local solar system in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. It was the location of a gateway, a transportation device, a permanent stable wormhole that the visitors had constructed in secret for humanity's use. The invitation was no longer just to a conversation, it was to a physical meeting. This new development triggered a fresh round of debate among the world's leaders. The military faction, led by an aging but still influential wing commander, Morley, was deeply suspicious. Was the gateway a trap, a Trojan horse? He argued for a cautious military-led approach, for sending unmanned probes through the gateway before any human mission was attempted. The scientific and diplomatic faction, led by Eleanor, argued for a bolder, more trusting approach. They have shown us nothing but good faith, she argued. They have given us the tools to save ourselves. They have welcomed us as equals. We must respond to their trust with trust of our own. We must go, and we must go in person. Eleanor's argument won the day. The world was weary of fear, of suspicion. The success of Project Chimera had created a new mood of optimism, of confidence. The decision was made to assemble a mission, a First Contact Part 3. It would be a small, diplomatic and scientific delegation, a team that would represent the whole of the human species. Its mission, to step through the gateway and to meet the visitors, face to face. There was no question about who would lead the mission. It had to be Eleanor. She was the bridge, the interface, the one human being who had a true, deep understanding of the visitor's consciousness. The selection of the rest of the team was a matter of intense global debate. Every nation wanted a representative. Every scientific discipline wanted a seat at the table. In the end, a small, diverse team was chosen, a group that represented the best of humanity. A brilliant young physicist from India, a veteran Russian cosmonaut, a philosopher and ethicist from Kenya, a bioengineer from Brazil, and a communications specialist from China. James Wickham, now in his late 80s, but still sharp and intellectually vibrant, served as a key advisor to the mission. He did not go himself. His body was too frail for the journey. But his wisdom, his deep historical perspective, was crucial in shaping the mission's diplomatic approach. Remember, he told Eleanor before she left, they are archivists, they are storytellers. The most valuable thing we can bring them is not our science or our technology, but our story. Tell them the story of humanity in all its glory and all its folly. That is the gift we can give them in return. Claire Osborne's agency was responsible for the security of the mission, not in a military sense, but in a human one. She had to vet the crew to ensure their psychological stability, their resilience. She also had to manage the public expectation, the immense global pressure that was being placed on this small group of individuals. Her work was a vital and often overlooked part of ensuring the mission's success. She was the guardian of the human element, the one who remembered that these pioneers were not just symbols, but fragile, fallible human beings. The journey to the Gateway was made in a new type of spacecraft, a vessel designed and built using the principles of the visitor's own technology. It was not a rocket, it was a warp ship, a vessel that could bend space-time around itself, allowing for near instantaneous travel within the solar system. The journey that had taken the Apollo astronauts 3 days now took less than an hour. Humanity was already beginning to master the tools of the gods. The Gateway was a breathtaking sight. It was a perfect, shimmering ring of light 1,000 kilometers in diameter, hanging in the silent darkness of the asteroid belt. It was not made of any physical material. It was a self-sustaining, stable rupture in the fabric of space-time. As the human ship approached, a new signal was received, a simple, elegant piece of mathematics that described the protocol for transit. It was a key, a handshake, an instruction for how to knock on the door. Eleanor stood on the bridge of the human ship, the Wanderer, as the pilot guided it towards the shimmering ring. She was surrounded by her small international crew, the best and brightest of their generation. They were all silent, their faces a mixture of awe, of fear, of a profound and shared sense of destiny. They were the new Argonauts, the new Columbuses, sailing into an unknown ocean, not of water, but of stars. Eleanor gave the final command. "Take us in," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The transit through the Gateway was not a journey in any conventional sense. There was no sense of movement, no feeling of acceleration. There was just a moment of profound and beautiful disorientation, a feeling of being simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. The fabric of reality seemed to dissolve into a symphony of light and color. Then, just as suddenly, it was over. The Wanderer emerged from the Gateway into a new and utterly alien space. They were not in another star system. They were in a vast, artificial structure, a sphere of such immense size that it dwarfed any planet. The interior of the sphere was a hollow, self-contained world. In the center was a small, stable, artificial sun. The inner surface of the sphere was a landscape of impossible, crystalline cities, of strange, alien vegetation, of oceans that glowed with a soft internal light. It was a Dyson sphere, a habitat built around a star. A concept that had been a staple of human science fiction, now made real. And in the space before them, a fleet of objects was waiting. They were not the simple, functional spheres and triangles of the previous encounters. These were vast, intricate, and breathtakingly beautiful craft, their surfaces a living, shifting tapestry of light and geometry. They were works of art, of architecture, of a technology that had become indistinguishable from beauty. It was a welcome party, a formal and magnificent reception. A single craft, larger and more ornate than the others, moved towards the Wanderer. A communication was received not by radio but directly, telepathically, into the minds of the crew. The message was not in words, but in a pure conceptual language of welcome, of friendship, of a deep and ancient joy. The visitors, the silent, enigmatic archivists, were finally, after millennia of patient observation, ready to speak. Eleanor Hartley, a human being from a small blue planet in a forgotten corner of the Milky Way, stepped forward to reply. She did not speak with her voice. She spoke with her mind, with the expanded consciousness that the Sentinel had given her. She spoke for her species, for her world, for the long, chaotic, and beautiful story of humanity. She replied with a single, simple, and heartfelt concept. Thank you. The conversation had begun. Back on Earth, The world watched and waited. The Wanderer had successfully passed through the gateway. For a few tense hours there had been silence. Then a new signal had been received, a simple message from Eleanor, relayed back through the gateway. The message was broadcast on every screen, in every nation. It was a message that brought tears of joy and relief to billions of people. The message was this: we have met them. They are our friends. The era of welcome had truly and finally begun. The days that followed the Wanderer's arrival in the Dyson sphere were a blur of discovery, a period of intense and joyful communication that was less a diplomatic negotiation and more a shared and mutual exploration of two vastly different cultures. The visitors, who called themselves the archivists, did not have individual bodies or names in the human sense. They were a collective consciousness, a unified mind, but they could also manifest as individual, autonomous points of awareness, each with its own personality, its own specialism. The crew of the Wanderer were interacting not with a single entity, but with a civilization. Eleanor Hartley was the primary conduit for these conversations. Her expanded consciousness allowed her to communicate with the archivists on their own conceptual level. She spent hours, days, in a state of deep, telepathic communion, a silent, motionless figure on the bridge of the Wanderer, while her mind roamed through the vast, living library of the archivist consciousness. She was learning their history, their philosophy, their science, a body of knowledge that was the accumulated wisdom of 1 billion years of existence. The rest of the crew had their own unique roles. The physicist from India worked with the archivist specialists in cosmology, her understanding of string theory and quantum mechanics expanding at an exponential rate. The Russian cosmonaut, a veteran of long-duration spaceflight, shared his knowledge of human physiology in extreme environments, a subject of immense interest to the archivists, who had long since left their own biological forms behind. The Kenyan philosopher engaged in long, complex debates with the archivist ethicists, discussing the nature of consciousness, of morality, of the meaning of life. The archivists were endlessly curious about humanity. They were fascinated by the concept of individuality, of separate competing consciousnesses. They were intrigued by human emotions, by our capacity for love, for hate, for grief, for joy, concepts that were alien to their own unified and serene existence. They were particularly fascinated by human art, by our need to create, to tell stories, to find beauty in a chaotic and often painful world. They saw humanity not as a primitive, undeveloped species, but as a young, vibrant, and incredibly interesting one, a species that had something new and valuable to add to the galactic conversation. Eleanor learned the true nature of the archivists' purpose. They were not just passive observers, they were cultivators. They saw the universe not as a random, empty space, but as a garden, a place where life in all its forms could be nurtured and encouraged to grow. Their non-interference principle was not a rigid dogma, but a guideline, a form of respect for the natural evolutionary process. They would not prevent a species from making its own mistakes, from facing its own challenges, but they would from a distance offer a helping hand, a nudge in the right direction, a silent gift of knowledge, a warning of an approaching storm. She also learned the true nature of the extrasolar pathogen. It was not a life form in the conventional sense. It was a form of cosmic, crystalline cancer, a rogue, self-replicating information pattern that consumed and destroyed carbon-based life. The archivists have been fighting a quiet billion-year war against it, not with weapons, but with knowledge, with bioengineering, with the careful, patient cultivation of life that was resistant to its deadly embrace. Humanity's successful defense of Earth was not just a local victory. It was a major battle won in this ancient galactic war. The crew of the Wanderer were given a tour of the Dyson Sphere. It was a world of impossible beauty and scale. They saw the vast, silent libraries where the memories of 1 million extinct species were stored. They saw the great cosmic observatories where the archivists monitored the universe, watching for the birth of new stars, the formation of new galaxies. They saw the art galleries where the creative works of 1,000 different civilizations were displayed, a testament to the universal and enduring power of beauty. One of the most profound moments for the crew was their visit to the Cradle. It was a vast, simulated environment within the Dyson Sphere, a place where the archivists had recreated the ecosystem of their own long-dead home world. It was a world of strange, beautiful, and utterly alien flora and fauna, the last living memory of the biological species. That had created the archivists. It was a museum, a memorial, and a sacred space, a reminder to the archivists of their own humble biological origins. During these explorations, the archivists shared their knowledge freely. They gave the human physicist the key to unifying general relativity and quantum mechanics, the theory of everything that human science had been searching for. They gave the bioengineer the tools to rewrite the human genome, to eliminate genetic disease, to extend the human lifespan indefinitely. They gave the communications specialist the technology for instantaneous, faster-than-light communication. They were giving humanity the keys to the kingdom, the tools to become a true, space-faring, galactic species. But the gifts came with a warning. The archivists had seen many species before humanity. They had seen them rise and they had seen them fall. The most common cause of extinction, they explained, was not external threats, but internal ones. The failure to manage the transition from a planetary to a galactic species, the failure to control the power of their own technology, the failure to overcome their own primitive tribal instincts. The gift of knowledge, they warned, was also the gift of self-destruction. The choice, as always, was humanity's. After a period of several weeks, which felt like a lifetime of learning and discovery, the time came for the Wanderer to return. The initial phase of the contact was over. The relationship had been established. The dialogue had begun. Now the human crew had to return to their own world, to share what they had learned, and to help their species navigate the profound and dangerous transition that lay ahead. The departure was not a sad one. It was a moment of shared purpose, of a new and powerful alliance. The archivists had found a new and promising young species to add to their galactic garden. Humanity had found a new and unimaginably ancient friend and mentor. The gateway remained open. The conversation would continue. The journey was not over. It was just beginning. As the Wanderer passed back through the gateway, back into its own familiar solar system, the crew felt a profound sense of culture shock. The vast, silent, and serene world of the archivists was gone, replaced by the noisy, chaotic, and vibrant world of humanity. They were returning as heroes, as pioneers, as the bearers of a new gospel of science and philosophy. But they were also returning as strangers, as individuals who had been fundamentally and irrevocably changed by their glimpse into the vast cosmic ocean. Eleanor felt this change more than anyone. The direct, sustained interface with the archivist consciousness had rewired her own. She was still human, but she was also something more. She could perceive the world in a new way. She could see the complex, interconnected patterns of life, of society, of history. She was no longer just a scientist. She was a visionary, a prophet, a woman who had seen the future and who now had the terrible and wonderful responsibility of helping to build it. The Wanderer's return to Earth was a moment of global celebration. The ship, a symbol of humanity's new galactic status, was greeted by vast, joyful crowds. The crew were hailed as the greatest explorers in human history. But in the corridors of power, the mood was more sober. The knowledge that the crew had brought back was a source of immense opportunity, but also of immense and terrifying risk. The world's leaders now had to manage a transition that was fraught with peril, a transition that could lead to a new golden age or to a new and final dark age. Eleanor's first duty on her return was to debrief the new, expanded UN Contact Committee. She spent days, weeks patiently explaining what she had learned, what she had seen. She described the archivists' history, their philosophy, their technology. She delivered their gift of knowledge, and she delivered their warning. She made it clear that the future was not guaranteed. The visitors had opened the door. It was up to humanity to have the wisdom and the courage to walk through it. The world listened. The message from the Wanderer mission, the message of hope, of opportunity, of profound and shared responsibility, resonated with a global population that was weary of conflict, of division, of the old, tired, terrestrial squabbles. The era of welcome was giving way to a new and even more challenging era, the era of integration, the era in which humanity had to learn to live with its new knowledge, its new power, and its new and awesome place in the universe. In the years that followed, humanity began the slow, difficult process of integrating the archivists' knowledge into its own society. The new technologies were developed, not by individual nations, but by global, cooperative projects, their benefits shared by all. The new philosophy, the archivists' perspective of a vast, interconnected and precious web of life, began to permeate human culture, to reshape our art, our politics, our religions. It was a slow and often painful process of growth, of a species shedding its adolescent skin and beginning to embrace its adult responsibilities. Eleanor, James and Claire, the original team from Yorkshire, remained at the heart of this process. Eleanor was the guide, the visionary. James was the conscience, the historian. Claire was the guardian, the one who dealt with the human consequences of the great transformation. They were old now, their lives a testament to the most extraordinary period of change in human history. They had been the bridge, the first contact, the ones who had stood on the shore and had greeted the silent, luminous visitors who had come from another galaxy, not with a threat, but with a gift, a warning and a welcome. And the visitors, the archivists, they watched from their silent, beautiful, and unimaginably distant home. They watched the young, chaotic, and brilliant species they had welcomed into the galactic community as it struggled and stumbled and slowly, surely began to find its way. They watched and they waited with the infinite, patient, and loving curiosity of a gardener watching a new and beautiful flower begin to bloom in the vast and ancient garden of the stars. The era of integration was, in essence, humanity's second childhood, but a childhood lived with the knowledge and the tools of an adult. The species was learning to walk again, but on a galactic stage, and the process was filled with moments of breathtaking progress and moments of terrifying, near disastrous failure. The wisdom of the archivists filtered through the mind of Eleanor Hartley, and the memory of the Sentinel was a guiding light, but it was not a panacea. Humanity had to learn its own lessons, to make its own mistakes, and to find its own unique path to maturity. One of the first and most profound challenges was the gift of longevity. The archivists' understanding of genetics and cellular regeneration had given humanity the ability to halt the aging process, to extend the human lifespan indefinitely. It was a medical miracle, the end of death by old age, but it was also a social and demographic time bomb. The planet's resources, already strained, were not prepared for a population that no longer died. The old models of birth, of family, of career of retirement were all rendered obsolete overnight. A new global debate erupted, a debate that was more fierce and more divisive than any that had come before. Who should receive the longevity treatment? Should it be available to all, or only to a select few? Should new births be limited? Should there be a system of voluntary, chosen death? These were questions that went to the very heart of what it meant to be human, and they created deep and often violent divisions in society. The gift of eternal life, it seemed, had come with the price of a profound and global identity crisis. Eleanor Hartley, now in her late 70s, but physically unchanged from the woman she had been 30 years earlier, was at the center of this debate. She argued for a system based on the archivist's own philosophy, a philosophy of balance, of sustainability, of respect for the integrity of the ecosystem. She advocated for a system of universal access to longevity, but also for a new global consensus on population management, a conscious, collective decision to bring humanity's growth into balance with the carrying capacity of the planet. It was a message that was both radical and deeply rational, and it was met with both fierce opposition and passionate support. James Wickham, from his position as the world's foremost exohistorian, provided a crucial perspective. He reminded the world that the archivists themselves were the product of a biological species that had failed to manage its own success. Their creators had achieved a form of technological immortality, but they had done so at the cost of their own planet, their own ecosystem. Their final, desperate act was to preserve their consciousness in a synthetic form, a tragic and eternal monument to a failure of wisdom. "We must not make the same mistake," James wrote in a widely read article. "The gift of long life is only a gift if we also learn how to live well and to live wisely." Claire Osborne's agency, the AECG, was on the front lines of the social disruption caused by the longevity debate. She had to deal with the rise of immortality cults, who saw longevity as a divine right and who violently opposed any form of population control. She also had to deal with the death acceptance movements, who saw the new technology as a form of hubris, a violation of the natural order, and who advocated for a return to the old, mortal way of life. Her job was no longer just about managing the contact with the alien. It was about managing the conflict within the human. While humanity wrestled with these profound internal challenges, the great work of exploration continued. The gateway in the asteroid belt was the first of many. The knowledge from the Sentinel had provided the locations of a dozen other gateways scattered throughout the Milky Way galaxy, a vast, ancient transportation network built by the archivists over millions of years. Humanity had been given the keys to the galaxy, and a new generation of explorers, of scientists, of diplomats, was being trained to take the first tentative steps into that larger world. Emma Hartley, Eleanor's daughter, was one of these new explorers. She had inherited her mother's brilliance, her curiosity, her quiet courage. She was the commander of the Wanderer II, the flagship of humanity's new and growing fleet of warp-capable vessels. Her missions were not of conquest, but of science, of diplomacy. She was leading the effort to explore the worlds that the archivists had mapped, to make contact with the other, less developed life forms that the archivists were silently, patiently observing. Humanity was now, in a small way, a junior partner in the archivists' great project. They were becoming gardeners themselves, learning the delicate and often difficult art of observing, of nurturing, of helping other species to grow without interfering in their natural development. It was a role that required a profound sense of humility, of patience, of a long-term perspective that was often at odds with the short-term, impatient nature of the human spirit. One of the first species that Emma's team made contact with was a sentient, aquatic species on a water world orbiting the star Kepler-F. They were a collective intelligence like the archivists, but a biological one, their consciousness distributed through a vast, planet-wide network of coral-like organisms. The communication was slow, difficult, a process of translating between two completely different forms of consciousness, but it was a success. It was humanity's own first, independent first contact, a moment of profound significance, a sign that the species was beginning to mature. The knowledge brought back from these missions and the continued, slow, and careful unlocking of the Sentinel's library was continuing to transform human society. The new science was not just about new technologies, it was about a new understanding of reality. The old divisions between science and spirituality, between the material and the conscious, were beginning to dissolve. The universe, the physicists were discovering, was not a dead, empty machine. It was a living, conscious, and interconnected system, a vast, thinking entity, of which humanity, and the archivists, and the sentient coral of Kepler F were all just a small and integral part. Eleanor Hartley, watching these developments from her position at the head of the Global Contact Committee, felt a sense of profound and deep satisfaction. The path had been difficult, the challenges immense, but humanity was learning. It was growing. It was beginning to embrace its new role, its new identity as a galactic citizen. The chaos and the conflict of the early years of the integration era were giving way to a new, more stable and more mature global and interstellar society. But the universe was still a dangerous place. The archivists' ancient war against the crystalline, life-destroying pathogen was not over. Humanity's successful defense of Earth had been a major victory, but it was just one battle in a long, ongoing campaign. The pathogen was still out there, still spreading through the galaxy. And there were other threats, other dangers, that the archivists had only hinted at. Other, less benign galactic intelligences, other, more ancient and more powerful entities that saw the rise of a new, energetic species like humanity, not as a welcome development, but as a potential threat. Wing Commander Morley, now the head of the new Unified Earth Defense Force, was responsible for preparing for these threats. His job was no longer about fighting other human beings, it was about protecting the entire solar system from potential extrasolar aggression. He was using the archivists' technology to build a new generation of defensive systems, of planetary shields, of advanced AI-driven sensor networks. He was the guardian at the gate, the silent, watchful soldier, standing between his species and the vast and unknown darkness of the galaxy. James Wickham's final book, published posthumously, became the foundational text for the new era. In the Garden of the Stars, he laid out a philosophical framework for humanity's future, a vision of a species that had embraced its role as a responsible and compassionate member of the galactic community. He argued that humanity's unique contribution, the gift it could bring to the ancient, serene, and perhaps lonely consciousness of the archivists, was its own unique and precious story, the story of its struggle, its art, its love, its irrational and beautiful and deeply human soul. Claire Osborne, in her final years as the head of the AECG, oversaw the creation of the Human Story Archive, a project to collect and preserve the personal individual stories of the integration era. It was a vast, living library of human experience, a testament to the countless, small, and often heroic ways in which ordinary people had adapted to the most extraordinary period of change in their species' history. It was the human equivalent of the archivist's own great library, a story not of gods and kings, but of ordinary people living through extraordinary times. 100 years after the solstice manifestation, the world was unrecognizable. Humanity had become a true interstellar species, with outposts on Mars, on Europa, and in the first tentative colonies around other stars. The old problems of war, of poverty, of disease were gone, replaced by new and more interesting problems. The challenges of interstellar diplomacy, of communication with alien life forms, of navigating the complex and often dangerous politics of the galaxy. Eleanor Hartley, her physical form unchanged, but her mind, a vessel of a century of unimaginable experience, stood on the observation deck of the Wanderer III, a new and even more advanced starship. She was looking out at a new and unexplored star system. Her team, a new generation of young, brilliant and adventurous humans, was preparing for a new first contact. The work was not over. The story was not finished. It was, and always would be, just beginning. She thought back to that cold, clear night in Yorkshire, a century ago. She thought of the silent, pulsing amber lights, of the profound and terrifying mystery they had represented. She thought of the long, strange journey that had begun on that night, a journey that had taken her and her species from a small, provincial planet to the heart of a galactic civilization. It had been a journey of fear, of wonder, of loss, and of profound and unexpected joy. It had been a good story, and as she gave the command to her young crew to begin their approach to the new alien world, she knew, with a deep and quiet certainty, that the best chapters were still to be written. The first century of the integration era was a period of explosive growth and outward expansion, but the second century was defined by a new and more subtle challenge, the challenge of depth. Humanity had spread across the stars, but it had not yet fully explored the depths of its own new and radically altered consciousness, the gifts of the archivists. Longevity, faster than light travel, a new understanding of the universe, had been integrated on a technical level, but their philosophical and psychological implications were only just beginning to be understood. Eleanor Hartley, now 200 years old but still physically in her late 30s, had transitioned from being a leader and a guide to being a more enigmatic, almost mythical figure. She had withdrawn from the day-to-day running of the interstellar government, leaving that to a new generation of politicians and administrators. She now lived in a quiet, isolated retreat in the mountains of what was once Switzerland, a place of study, of meditation, of continued silent communion with the Sentinel and the vast cosmic consciousness of the archivists. Her primary concern was what she called the psychic drift. The human mind, designed for a short, linear lifespan on a single planet, was struggling to adapt to the new reality of near immortality and interstellar travel. A new kind of mental illness was emerging, a form of existential ennui, of a profound and deeply disorienting loss of meaning. People were living for centuries, but they were forgetting how to live. The old stories, the old myths, the old religions that had given human life its meaning and its purpose had been swept away by the new science, and nothing had yet fully replaced them. Emma Hartley, Eleanor's daughter, was on the front lines of this new psychological frontier. As the commander of the exploration fleet, she was witnessing the effects of the psychic drift on her own crews. The long, lonely voyages between the stars, the constant exposure to the strange and often incomprehensible realities of alien worlds was taking its toll. Her best and brightest explorers were suffering from a new kind of space madness, a quiet, creeping despair that was more dangerous than any asteroid field or hostile alien. She came to her mother for guidance. "We've conquered space," she said, her voice heavy with the weariness of her long command. "But we're losing our own souls. We're becoming ghosts in our own perfect, immortal machines." Eleanor listened, her ancient, wise eyes filled with a deep and compassionate understanding. "We have been given a new map of the universe," she replied, "but we have not yet drawn a new map of the self. That is the work of your generation, Emma, to be the cartographers of the new human soul." This conversation was the catalyst for a new global project, a project that was as ambitious and as important as Project Chimera had been a century earlier. It was called the Human Story Project. Its goal was to create a new and evolving set of myths, of stories, of philosophical and spiritual frameworks that could give meaning and purpose to a species that had lost its old anchors. It was a project that brought together artists, poets, philosophers, theologians, and psychologists from across the human worlds. The project was headquartered in the city of New London, a vast archaeological metropolis on the moon, a city that was a testament to the new, global, and spacefaring civilization that humanity had become. It was a city of breathtaking beauty, of soaring crystalline towers and vast subterranean parks, a place where all the cultures of Earth and its new colonies came together in a vibrant, chaotic, and creative mix. One of the leading figures in the Human Story Project was a young historian named Kaelen, a man who had made his name by writing a definitive, multi-volume history of the integration era. Kaelen was a brilliant, charismatic, and deeply ambitious scholar. He believed that the key to humanity's future lay in its past, in the rediscovery and reinterpretation of the old pre-contact myths and legends. He argued that humanity needed a new, unifying story, a single, grand narrative that could bind the species together in a shared sense of identity and purpose. His vision was a powerful one, and it quickly gained a wide following. He became a global celebrity, his lectures and his writings translated into 100 different languages. He was seen by many as the new intellectual leader of the species, the one who could provide the answers to the profound existential questions that were haunting the new, immortal society. But his vision also had a dark side. His call for a single unifying story was seen by others as a call for a new and dangerous form of cultural conformity, a new kind of global orthodoxy that would stifle dissent and diversity. Eleanor Hartley watched Kaelen's rise with a sense of deep unease. She recognized his brilliance, his passion, but she also saw in him a familiar and dangerous pattern, the pattern of the charismatic leader who believes that he and he alone has the answer. She had seen it before, in the old pre-contact world, in the demagogues and the dictators who had led humanity to the brink of self-destruction. She knew that the search for a single, simple answer to the complex, messy reality of the human condition was a path that led inevitably to tyranny. She decided to intervene not directly, but in her own subtle and indirect way. She invited Kaelen to her retreat in the Alps. She did not argue with him or debate him. She simply shared with him her own long perspective. She gave him access to the Sentinel, to the vast cosmic library of the archivists. She showed him the stories of the 1,000 million other species that the archivists had observed. She showed him that the universe was not a single story, but a chorus, a symphony of 1 billion different voices, each one unique, each one precious. The experience changed Kaelen. He went into the meeting a prophet, a man with a single clear vision. He came out a philosopher, a man with 1,000 new questions. He had seen the vast and beautiful complexity of the universe, and he had understood the arrogance of his own small and singular vision. He abandoned his quest for a single, unifying myth. He became instead a champion of diversity, of complexity, of the idea that humanity's strength lay not in its unity, but in its infinite and beautiful variety. The Human Story Project, under Kaelen's new and more humble leadership, flourished. It became not a project to create a single new myth, but a project to celebrate and to explore the countless different myths that humanity had already created and was continuing to create. It was a project that found value not just in the grand, epic narratives of heroes and of gods, but also in the small, quiet, personal stories of ordinary people living their long and often difficult lives in a strange and wonderful new universe. Emma Hartley's exploration fleet played a key role in this. Her teams began to work with exoanthropologists, with alien linguists, with artists, and with storytellers. Their mission was no longer just to map new worlds, but to understand new cultures, to collect new stories, to add new and alien voices to the great and growing chorus of the galactic community. Humanity was learning to be not just a gardener, but also a listener. But the psychic drift was not just a philosophical problem, it was also a medical one. The human brain, for all its plasticity, was not designed for immortality. After 2 or 3 centuries of life, many people began to experience a form of memory saturation, a cognitive decline, a slow, gentle fading of the self. It was a new and tragic form of dementia, a disease of the soul as much as of the mind. The search for a cure for this new existential plague became the great scientific challenge of the 3rd century of the integration era. The answer, once again, lay in the Sentinel, in the deep and complex science of the archivists. It was discovered that the archivists themselves, for all their synthetic immortality, faced a similar problem, a form of information overload. Their solution was a process they called the shedding, a periodic and voluntary process of forgetting, of wiping clean the slate of their own accumulated memories, of being, in effect, reborn. This was a concept that was profoundly alien and deeply disturbing to the human sense of self. The idea of voluntarily giving up one's own precious memories, the very things that made one who one was, seemed like a form of suicide. But it was also, the scientists began, to realize the only solution. To live forever, it seemed, one also had to be willing to die and to be reborn again and again. A new and even more profound debate began. Was the price of immortality, the loss of the self, was it a price worth paying? Humanity was facing its next great evolutionary choice. It had conquered space, it had conquered death. Now, it had to conquer the very definition of what it meant to be a self, an individual, a human being. The journey into the stars had become a journey into the deepest and most mysterious territory of all, the territory of the human soul. The concept of the shedding, the archivist's solution to the problem of eternal memory, sent a shockwave through human society. It was a technology, a medical procedure, but it was also a philosophy, a religion, a new and terrifying definition of life and of death. The debate it triggered was not just about science, it was about the soul. For the first time, humanity had to confront the question not of how to live longer, but of how to live forever and what it might mean to leave one's self behind in order to do so. The procedure itself, as outlined in the Sentinel's library, was a marvel of neuroengineering. It was a process of targeted, controlled amnesia, a gentle and precise pruning of the synaptic connections that formed the basis of memory. It was not a complete wipe. An individual could choose which memories to keep, which to discard. One could, in theory, keep the memory of a loved one but discard the pain of their loss. One could keep the wisdom of a long life but discard the weariness, the cynicism, the accumulated baggage of centuries of experience. The first human trials of the shedding were conducted in secret at a secure medical facility on a remote, terraformed moon. The volunteers were all individuals in the advanced stages of memory saturation, their minds already beginning to fade. The results were miraculous. The patients emerged from the procedure not as empty shells, but as renewed, refreshed versions of their former selves. They were still them, they had the same personalities, the same core identities, but they were lighter. The weight of centuries had been lifted. They were, in effect, young again, not in body, but in mind. The public announcement of the successful trials created a global sensation. The technology was hailed as the final piece of the puzzle, the solution to the last great problem of immortality. But it also created a deep and profound sense of unease. The idea of tampering with one's own memory, the very fabric of one's identity, was deeply unsettling. It was a power that seemed too great, too dangerous for human hands. Eleanor Hartley, from her mountain retreat, watched this new debate with a sense of weary familiarity. It was the same pattern she had seen again and again, a new, transformative. Technology is introduced, and humanity is immediately and violently divided between those who embrace it as a savior and those who fear it as a curse. She knew that the shedding was necessary, that it was the only way for a long-lived species to remain sane. But she also knew that the transition would be a painful and potentially dangerous one. Kalin, the historian-philosopher, became the leading advocate for the new technology. He saw it not as a loss of self, but as a form of liberation, a way to free the human spirit from the prison of the past. He argued that the self was not a static, fixed thing, but a story, a narrative, and that the shedding was simply a way of editing that story, of starting a new chapter. He became the first healthy, public figure to undergo the procedure, a powerful and symbolic act of faith in the new technology. His public rebirth was a global media event. He emerged from the procedure with his intellect, his charisma, his passion, all intact. But he was different. The old, cynical, world-weary edge was gone. He was filled with a new, almost childlike sense of wonder, of curiosity. He had kept the knowledge of his long life, but he had shed the weight of it. He was a living testament to the power and the promise of the new technology. But there was also a powerful opposition. The continuity movements, as they came to be known, argued that the self was sacred, that memory was inviolable. They saw the shedding as a form of suicide, a betrayal of one's own unique and precious life story. They were led by a charismatic new figure, a woman named Lyra, a poet and an artist who argued that human life, with all its pain, its sorrow, its imperfections, was a work of art, and that to erase any part of it was a form of vandalism. Lyra's message resonated with millions. She spoke for those who feared the new, sterile, and seemingly perfect world that the archivist's technology was creating. She spoke for those who valued the messy, chaotic, and deeply human experience of a single, unedited life. The debate between Kalin and Lyra, between the philosophy of renewal and the philosophy of continuity, became the defining cultural conflict of the age. Emma Hartley's exploration fleet found itself at the center of this conflict. The crews of her ships, the long-lived interstellar explorers, were the ones who were most in need of the shedding technology. But they were also the ones who were most resistant to it. Their memories, their experiences were their most valuable asset, the source of their skill, their wisdom, their identity. The idea of giving up any part of that was anathema to them. Emma herself was torn. She saw the necessity of the procedure. She saw the toll that memory saturation was taking on her crews. But she also sympathized with their resistance. She was a woman who had lived for 2 centuries, who had seen more of the universe than any human in history. Her memories were who she was. The thought of erasing them, even the painful ones, felt like a betrayal of her own extraordinary life. She sought the counsel of the archivists. She travelled through the gateway to the Dyson sphere, and she put the question to the ancient collective consciousness. How can we live forever if it means we must forget who we are? The archivist's reply was, as always, simple, profound, and deeply challenging. The self is not a memory, they communicated. It is a process. It is a river, not a statue. To live is to change. To live forever is to change forever. The shedding is not a loss of self. It is an affirmation of it. It is the ultimate embrace of the process of becoming. This answer gave Emma the clarity she had been seeking. She returned to her fleet, and she began a new and difficult conversation with her crews. She did not order them to undergo the procedure. She did not try to persuade them. She simply shared with them the archivist's wisdom. She started a dialogue, a process of collective and individual soul-searching. She created a culture in which the decision to undergo the shedding was not a medical one, but a personal and deeply spiritual one. Back on Earth, the conflict between the renewalists and the continuists was becoming more intense. It was a war of ideas, but it was beginning to spill over into violence. The debate was no longer just philosophical, it was political. The global government had to decide whether the shedding should be a regulated technology, a matter of personal choice, or something else entirely. Eleanor Hartley, for the first time in a century, intervened directly in global politics. She addressed the UN General Assembly. She did not take a side in the debate. She did not endorse Kaelin or Lyra. Instead, she argued for a third way, the way of choice. The gift of the archivists is not a single simple answer, she said, her voice carrying the weight of her 3 centuries of experience. It is the gift of choice, the choice to live a single, precious, mortal life, the choice to live a long, continuous, and unbroken one, or the choice to live many lives, to be reborn, to start again. The technology is a tool. It is up to us as individuals and as a species to decide how to use it. The only wrong answer is to try and force a single answer on everyone. Her speech was a turning point. It was a message of wisdom, of tolerance, of a deep and profound respect for the diversity of the human experience. It diffused the tension, lowered the temperature of the debate. The global government, following her lead, passed the Consciousness Charter, a historic piece of legislation that enshrined the principle of cognitive liberty, the right of every individual to choose their own unique path to selfhood. Humanity, once again, had been brought to the brink of a new and dangerous internal conflict, and had, at the last moment, chosen the path of wisdom, of tolerance, of a new and more mature form of freedom. The era of integration was not just about integrating alien technology, it was about integrating the profound and often contradictory truths of its own newly expanded human nature. In the decades that followed, human society began to diversify in a new and radical way. There were the ephemerals who chose to live a single, natural lifespan, to experience the beauty and the tragedy of a mortal life. There were the continuants who used the longevity technology to live for centuries, their minds vast and sometimes weary repositories of accumulated knowledge and experience. And there were the cycles who embraced the shedding, who lived a series of different lives, each one a new story, a new adventure. Their identities are constantly shifting, an evolving work of art. This new tripartite structure of human society was complex, challenging, and endlessly fascinating. It was a new and unprecedented experiment in the nature of consciousness, and it was a source of immense interest to the archivists, who watched with their ancient, patient, and loving curiosity as their young and brilliant and chaotic friends, the human race, continued to explore the infinite and beautiful and terrifying possibilities of what it meant to be alive. The Consciousness Charter, for all its wisdom, did not solve the problems of a multi-form humanity. It simply gave them a framework, a language, and a set of rules. The 4th century of the integration era was defined by the complex and often fraught interactions between the 3 new branches of the human species: the ephemerals, the continuants, and the cycles. It was an era of profound social experimentation, of new forms of art, of new kinds of love, of new, and previously unimagined, ways of being human. The ephemerals, who chose to live a single, natural lifespan, became the keepers of a certain kind of human truth. They lived with a sense of urgency, of preciousness, that their long-lived counterparts often lacked. Their art, their music, their literature was filled with a poignant and beautiful awareness of the fragility of life, of the sweetness of a fleeting moment. They were a constant and necessary reminder to the other branches of humanity that a life's value is not measured in its length, but in its depth. The continuants, who lived for centuries without undergoing the shedding, became the great living libraries of the species. They were the historians, the scientists, the philosophers, their minds vast repositories of accumulated knowledge. They were the guardians of the long-term perspective, the ones who could see the great, slow-moving patterns of history, of science, of the evolution of the species. But they also paid a price for their long memory. They were prone to a deep and profound melancholy, a weariness of the soul that came from having seen too much, from having lost too many loved ones, from carrying the weight of too many centuries. The cycles, who embraced the shedding, were the artists, the explorers, the innovators. They were the embodiment of change, of renewal, of the endless creative potential of the human spirit. Each of their lives was a new canvas, a new story. They were the ones who pushed the boundaries of human experience, who traveled to the farthest reaches of the galaxy, who made contact with the strangest and most alien of life forms. But they also struggled with a unique form of identity crisis, a sense of disconnection from their own past selves, a feeling of being a stranger in their own long life. Eleanor Hartley, herself a unique and solitary figure who did not fit neatly into any of the three branches, observed this new, tripartite humanity with a mixture of fascination and concern. She was a continuant in the sense that she had lived for centuries, but the nature of her interface with the Sentinel had given her a mind that was not subject to the same wearying effects of memory saturation. She was, in effect, a new and fourth kind of human, a bridge between the human and the archivist consciousness. Her great fear was that the three branches would drift apart, that they would become so different in their outlook, in their values, in their very experience of reality, that they would cease to be a single species. She saw the danger of a new and profound form of tribalism, a tribalism based not on race or nation or religion, but on the very nature of one's own chosen mode of existence. This fear was realized when a new and dangerous political movement began to emerge, a movement that called for the separation of the three branches. The purists, as they called themselves, argued that the different forms of humanity were no longer compatible, that they should live in separate worlds, in separate star systems, that they should be free to develop along their own unique evolutionary paths. It was a new and seductive form of apartheid, a call for a clean and simple solution to a complex and messy reality. The purist movement was strongest among the ephemerals, who often felt patronized and marginalized by their long-lived counterparts. It was also popular among a certain faction of the continuants, who were weary of the chaotic and unpredictable energy of the cycles. The movement was a threat to the very idea of a united human species, a threat to the fragile and hard-won global and interstellar consensus. Emma Hartley, now a veteran commander of the exploration fleet and a cycle herself, having undergone the shedding several times, was one of the most powerful voices against the purist movement. Her crews were a mix of all three branches of humanity, a working, and successful model of integration, she argued that the strength of humanity lay precisely in its new and radical diversity. The ephemerals teach us how to live, she said, in a famous speech that was broadcast across the human worlds. The continuance teach us how to remember, and the cycles teach us how to dream. We need all three. To separate them would be to cripple ourselves, to lose the very thing that makes us unique and strong. Kalin, the philosopher, also joined the fight against the purists. He had spent his long life in his many different reborn selves, studying the history of human conflict. He saw in the purist movement the same old and deadly pattern, the fear of the other, the desire for a simple and pure identity, the belief that the solution to the complexity of life is to eliminate the complexity. He dedicated his current life, his current self, to fighting this new and insidious form of prejudice. But the purist movement was powerful, and it had a charismatic new leader, a man named Yorick, an ephemeral who argued with a fierce and passionate eloquence for the right of his people to live and to die on their own terms, free from the influence and the pity of the immortals. He was not a villain. He was a man who was fighting for the dignity of his own chosen way of life. And his message was a powerful one. The crisis came to a head at the 4th Centennial Interstellar Congress, a gathering of representatives from all the human worlds. Yorick and the purists proposed a motion for separate and autonomous development, a formal and legal separation of the three branches of humanity. The motion had a real chance of passing. The dream of a united human species was on the verge of collapse. Eleanor Hartley, for the second time in her long life, decided to intervene directly in the political process. She travelled to the Congress, which was being held on the city world of New London. Her arrival was a moment of immense and dramatic significance. She was a living legend, a figure from the dawn of the integration era, a woman who had not been seen in public for decades. The entire Congress fell silent as she entered the Great Hall. She did not make a speech. She did not argue or debate. She simply stood before the assembled representatives, and she opened her mind. She used the power of her expanded consciousness, the power that the Sentinel had given her, to connect for a brief and silent moment with every single person in the room. She did not show them an argument. She showed them a memory. Her memory. The memory of what it had been like to be a part of a single, unified, and mortal humanity. A species that had been brought to the brink of extinction and had, at the last moment, chosen to unite, to work together to save itself. She showed them the fear and the hope of Project Chimera. She showed them the wonder of the first contact. She showed them the courage of the first crew of the Wanderer. She reminded them of the long and difficult journey they had all been on together. She reminded them that they were all, regardless of their chosen mode of existence, the children of that small and brave and foolish and beautiful species that had been born on a single blue planet a long, long time ago. Her silent telepathic message was more powerful than any speech. It was a reminder of a shared history, a shared identity, a shared destiny. It was a reminder that the things that united them were deeper and more powerful than the things that divided them. When she had finished, there was a long and profound silence in the great hall. Then Yorick, the leader of the purists, a man with tears streaming down his face, stood up, and he formally withdrew his motion. The crisis was over. Humanity had once again faced a profound internal division and had once again chosen the path of unity, of integration, of a more complex and more difficult form of togetherness. The Congress, under Eleanor's quiet and wise guidance, went on to create a new and more flexible framework for interstellar governance, a framework that celebrated and protected the diversity of the three branches, while at the same time affirming their fundamental and unbreakable unity as a single human species. Eleanor returned to her mountain retreat, her work done. She knew that there would be other challenges, other crises. The human story was a messy and a difficult one, but she also knew that the species had a deep and resilient capacity for wisdom, for compassion, for finding its way back to its own better nature. She had seen it happen again and again, and she had a quiet and profound faith that it would continue to do so long after she and her own long and strange and beautiful story had finally come to an end. The resolution of the purest crisis marked a turning point in the evolution of the tripartite human society. The threat of separation had forced the three branches to confront their interdependence, to recognize that their differences were not a weakness, but a source of collective strength. The 5th century of the integration era was a period of renewed cooperation, of a conscious and deliberate effort to build a society that was not just tolerant of its own internal diversity, but one that actively celebrated it. New, hybrid communities began to emerge, cities and worlds where ephemerals, continuance, and cycles lived and worked side by side, their different perspectives and life philosophies creating a vibrant and dynamic cultural ecosystem. The arts flourished with new forms of expression that were born from the dialogue between the different modes of existence. There was the ephemeral opera, a form of musical theatre that was designed to be performed only once, its beauty heightened by its own fleeting mortality. There was the continuate novel, a form of literature that spanned centuries, its characters and its plot lines evolving over vast and realistic timescales. And there was the cyclical sculpture, a form of art that was designed to be constantly and endlessly reshaped and reinterpreted by its audience. Science also benefited from this new, integrated approach. Research teams were now deliberately composed of members from all three branches. The continuance provided the deep knowledge, the long-term perspective. The cycles provided the creativity, the willingness to take risks, to think outside the box. And the ephemerals provided the focus, the drive, the passionate, and often impatient desire to find answers to the great and pressing questions of the day. This new collaborative model led to a series of breathtaking scientific breakthroughs. Humanity, using the foundational knowledge of the archivists, began to develop its own unique and powerful science. They learned how to engineer new and stable gateways, allowing them to expand their exploration of the galaxy. They developed a new form of artificial intelligence, a form that was based not on the cold, pure logic of the archivists, but on the messy, intuitive, and emotional nature of the human mind. It was a form of A1 that was not just intelligent, but also wise and compassionate. Eleanor Hartley, from her quiet retreat, watched these developments with a sense of deep and quiet pride. Her species was finally and truly standing on its own 2 feet. They were no longer just the students of the archivists, they were becoming their peers, their partners in the great cosmic project of understanding and celebrating the universe. She had less and less need to intervene, to guide. Her children were growing up, and they were learning to find their own way. Her own role was changing. She was becoming less of a guide and more of a guardian, a silent, watchful presence, a living symbol of the species' long and difficult journey. She spent most of her time in communion with the Sentinel, her mind roaming the vast, silent library of the archivists, her consciousness expanding to a level that was now almost indistinguishable from the ancient galactic intelligence itself. She was becoming less human and more something else, something new, a true and final bridge between the two species. It was during one of these long, deep communions that she learned of the new threat. It was a threat that the archivists themselves had not anticipated, a danger that was not from outside the galaxy, but from within it. It was a threat that was not to humanity's physical survival, but to its very soul. The archivists called it the static. The static was a form of information plague, a subtle and insidious corruption of the very fabric of consciousness. It was not a living thing, but a rogue, self-replicating idea, a meme that had been created by accident by a long-dead and highly advanced civilization. The idea was simple and terrifyingly seductive, the idea that the universe was a simulation, a meaningless and ultimately pointless game. This idea, once it took root in a civilization's collective consciousness, was a slow-acting poison. It drained the life, the purpose, the meaning from everything. If nothing was real, then nothing mattered. Art, love, science, exploration. All became pointless gestures in a meaningless dream. Civilizations that were infected by the static did not die out in a blaze of glory. They simply faded away. They stopped creating, they stopped exploring, they stopped living. They retreated into a state of passive and eternal apathy, their great and beautiful cultures slowly and silently crumbling into dust. The archivists had encountered the static many times before. They were immune to it themselves. Their own logical and dispassionate consciousness was not susceptible to this kind of existential despair, but they had watched with a profound and helpless sorrow as many other promising young civilizations had succumbed to its deadly and silent embrace. And now their sensors were detecting the first, faint and terrifying signs of the static at the edges of human-explored space. Eleanor knew that this was a threat that was far more dangerous than the extrasolar pathogen had been. The pathogen had been a physical threat, something that could be fought with science, with technology. But the static was a spiritual threat, a disease of the mind. It could not be fought with weapons or with shields. It could only be fought with an idea. It could only be fought with a story. She brought the warning to the leaders of the human worlds. The news was met with a new kind of fear, a fear that was deeper and more unsettling than any that had come before. How could they fight an idea? How could they inoculate a civilization against despair? The military, the scientists, the engineers who had saved the world a century earlier were powerless against this new and insidious enemy. The task of fighting the static fell to the Human Story Project, to the artists, the philosophers, the storytellers. It was they who had to find the answer, the counter-narrative, the story that was powerful enough to resist the seductive and deadly poison of cosmic meaninglessness. Kalen, now in his 5th reborn life, found himself on the front lines of a new and far more difficult kind of war. He and his team began a desperate search for the answer. They delved into the great and ancient stories of humanity, the myths, the religions, the philosophies that had given their ancestors the strength to face the darkness of their own mortal and often brutal world. They also looked to the new and alien stories that the exploration fleet had collected from other living and thriving civilizations. They were looking for a common thread, a universal truth, a story that was powerful enough to hold back the tide of cosmic despair. Emma Hartley's fleet was retasked. Their mission was no longer just to explore, but to search, to seek out other civilizations that had successfully resisted the static. They were looking for survivors, for allies, for anyone who had found a way to keep the flame of meaning alive in the face of the great and silent emptiness of the universe. It was a long and often discouraging search. They found the ruins of many civilizations that had fallen to the static, their beautiful and complex societies now just silent and empty, monuments to a forgotten despair. But they also found survivors. They found a species of crystalline, silicon-based life forms that had found meaning in the elegant and eternal beauty of pure mathematics. They found a species of gaseous, cloud-like beings that had found purpose in the creation of a single, vast and ever-changing collective work of art. They found that the universe was not empty of meaning, it was filled with a million different and beautiful meanings. The answer, Kalin and his team began to realize, was not to find a single, new, unifying story. The answer was to embrace the diversity of stories. The static was a monoculture, a single, all-consuming idea. The only defense against it was a vibrant and resilient ecosystem of different and competing and coexisting ideas. The answer was not to build a wall against the darkness, but to light a million different and beautiful candles. The Human Story Project changed its mission. It was no longer just about collecting and celebrating stories. It was about creating them. It was about seeding the human worlds with a new and radical diversity of thought, of art, of philosophy. It was about encouraging a new and chaotic and beautiful explosion of human creativity. It was a project to make the human spirit so vibrant, so interesting, so full of a million different and passionate meanings that the simple and boring idea of meaninglessness could find no purchase. Eleanor Hartley, from her mountain, watched this new and creative and chaotic response to the great threat, and she smiled. Her species had once again found its own unique and deeply human solution. They had not responded with fear or with weapons or with a single, rigid and dogmatic answer. They had responded with art, with stories, with a passionate and defiant and beautiful celebration of the very thing that the static sought: to destroy the messy and chaotic and, ultimately and profoundly, meaningful business of being alive. The war against the static was a war fought not on battlefields, but in the hearts and minds of every individual human being. It was a long, quiet and generational struggle, a constant and vigilant effort to keep the flame of meaning alive in a universe that was on its surface cold and vast and indifferent. The Human Story Project was the central command of this war, but the soldiers were the artists, the teachers, the parents, the lovers, the individuals who, in their own small and everyday ways, chose to create and to share and to celebrate meaning. Human society in the 6th century of the integration era was a strange and beautiful and chaotic thing. It was a society that had deliberately, and as a matter of survival, embraced a radical pluralism. There was no single dominant culture, no single accepted truth. There were a million different and often contradictory subcultures, philosophies, religions, and ways of life, all coexisting in a vibrant and sometimes tense and always creative ecosystem of ideas. There were the deep ecologists, who lived in self-sustaining, bio-integrated communities, who saw meaning in the complex and beautiful web of life on 1,000 different and alien worlds. There were the cosmic Orphics, who found a strange and beautiful and tragic meaning in the idea that the universe was a fallen, broken thing, and that the purpose of life was to create moments of beauty and of love in the midst of the darkness. There were the techno-ascetics, who had abandoned their physical bodies altogether, who lived as pure digital consciousnesses in the vast and complex information networks that now spanned the galaxy, who found meaning in the elegant and infinite dance of pure data. This radical diversity was humanity's greatest defense against the static. The information plague could not find a foothold in a civilization that was so full of different and passionate and deeply held beliefs. It was like a virus trying to infect a species that had 1 billion different and incompatible immune systems. But this diversity was also a source of constant internal friction. The society was dynamic and creative, but it was also unstable and prone to new and strange and often bizarre forms of conflict. Eleanor Hartley, now in her 5th century of life, had become a figure of almost pure and silent contemplation. She rarely left her mountain retreat. Her communion with the sentinel and with the archivist consciousness was now almost constant. She was the anchor, the still point, in the turning and chaotic world of humanity. She was the one who remembered the long and difficult journey that had brought them to this point. She was the one who held the deep and quiet and unwavering faith in her species' ability to navigate the storm. Her daughter Emma was now an old woman even by the standards of the continuance. She had lived for 4 centuries. She had commanded the exploration fleet for 2 of them. She had seen more of the galaxy than any human who had ever lived. She had chosen not to undergo the shedding to live a single, long and unbroken life. She was a living library of experience, a legend in her own right. And she was tired. She came to her mother's retreat for the last time. She was not ill. Her body was as healthy as it had been a century earlier, but her mind, her soul, was weary. She had carried the weight of her long life, of her great responsibilities, and she was ready to lay it down. She had chosen to die. She was one of the first and most famous of the voluntary ephemerals, individuals who had lived a long life and who now freely and consciously chose to end it. Her decision was a profound and a controversial one, but it was also a powerful and a beautiful one. It was a statement that a life's meaning is not in its length, but in its completion. It was a rejection of the fear of death, an embrace of the natural and beautiful cycle of life and of ending. Her death was not a tragedy. It was a work of art, a final and perfect and beautiful story. Eleanor sat with her daughter in her final days. They did not speak much. They did not need to. They shared a bond that was deeper than words, a bond that had been forged in the fires of a century of unimaginable change. Eleanor did not grieve for her daughter's choice. She understood it. She respected it. She saw the beauty and the wisdom in it. She was a mother, letting go of her child, not to a cold and empty darkness, but to a new and profound and chosen form of peace. Emma's death had a profound impact on human society. It gave a new and powerful legitimacy to the idea of a chosen and a meaningful end. It helped to create a new and more balanced culture, a culture that could embrace the gift of long life without losing its respect for the wisdom and the beauty of a finite and a completed one. The 3 branches of humanity, the ephemerals, the continuance, and the cycles, began to see themselves not as separate and competing ways of life, but as different and equally valid chapters in the great and ongoing story of what it meant to be human. In the centuries that followed, humanity achieved a new and a more stable and a more mature equilibrium. The war against the static was not won. It was a war that could never be won, but it was managed. The species had learned to live with the constant and subtle threat of meaninglessness, and it had learned to fight it, not with weapons, but with art, with love, with 1 million different and beautiful and constantly evolving stories. Humanity had become a true and a wise and a beautiful galactic civilization. They were the explorers, the artists, the storytellers, the gardeners, the keepers of 1,000, different and precious, flames of meaning in the vast and silent and beautiful darkness of the galaxy. They had taken the gifts of the archivists and they had made them their own. They had created a civilization that was a unique and a beautiful and a deeply and wonderfully human thing. Eleanor Hartley, her long and extraordinary life, finally and gently, coming to its own natural end, allowed her consciousness to merge one last time with the vast and silent and loving mind of the archivists. She had been the bridge, the guide, the mother of a new and a reborn species. Her work was done, her story was complete. Her final thought was not of the stars or of the great and cosmic drama she had been a part of. It was a simple and a human thought. It was a memory from a long, long time ago. It was the memory of a cold and a clear and a silent night in the Yorkshire Dales. It was the memory of a young and a frightened and a hopeful woman looking up at a sky that was filled with a new and a terrifying and a beautiful and an unknown light. It was the memory of a beginning. And the archivists, the ancient and patient and loving gardeners of the stars, they received her final and beautiful and human story, and they added it to their own vast and infinite and ever-growing library. And they watched, and they waited, and they listened for the next new and beautiful story to begin. The legacy of Eleanor Hartley was not one of monuments or of laws, but of a fundamental shift in the consciousness of her species. She had been the fulcrum upon which human history had turned, the individual who had guided a planetary species into a galactic age. Her passing was not mourned in the traditional sense. It was celebrated as the completion of a great and beautiful life, a story that had become a foundational myth for the new tripartite humanity. Her consciousness merged with the Sentinel and the Archivist collective, became a silent, guiding presence, a constant and loving ancestor watching over her sprawling and chaotic family. In the 7th century of the Integration era, the focus of human civilization shifted once more. The great challenges of the past, the extrasolar pathogen, the Purist crisis, the war against the static, had been overcome or at least managed. Humanity had achieved a stable, mature, and dynamic equilibrium. The new frontier was not external but internal. It was the exploration of the deepest and most mysterious territory of all, the nature of consciousness itself. The science born from the Sentinel's library had given humanity a complete understanding of the physical universe. The new challenge was to develop a science of the subjective universe, a physics of the soul. This quest was led by the Inward Bound movement, a loose coalition of scientists, philosophers, and mystics from all three branches of humanity. They sought to understand the fundamental nature of experience, of self, of the strange and beautiful and utterly mysterious fact that the universe was aware of itself. The continuance, with their vast and long-ranging memories, were the historians of this new science, tracing the evolution of consciousness through the long and complex history of the species. The cycles, with their fluid and ever-changing identities, were the experimental subjects, the pioneers, willing to explore the radical and often dangerous frontiers of subjective experience. And the ephemerals, with their precious and finite lifespans, were the poets, the ones who could articulate the profound and often ineffable beauty of a single, fleeting moment of awareness. This new science led to the development of consciousness engineering, the ability to design and to create new forms of subjective experience. It was a technology that was even more powerful and even more dangerous than the longevity treatments or the shedding. It was the ability to create new senses, new emotions, new ways of perceiving reality. It was the ability to literally and deliberately shape the fabric of one's own soul. The first applications of this technology were therapeutic. It was used to cure the last remaining forms of mental illness, to heal the deep and ancient traumas of the human psyche. It was used to create new forms of empathy, to allow individuals to literally and directly experience the subjective reality of another person, another species, another way of being. It was a technology of profound and radical compassion. But it also had a darker and more seductive potential. It could be used to create artificial paradises, to design worlds of pure and unadulterated pleasure, free from all pain, all struggle, or challenge. A new and powerful hedonistic culture began to emerge, the Lotus Eaters, who chose to retreat from the messy and difficult reality of the physical world into these perfect and, ultimately, sterile, simulated heavens. The Lotus Eater phenomenon was a new and subtle form of the static. It was not a philosophy of meaninglessness, but a practice of it. It was a retreat from the very things that gave life its meaning, the struggle, the growth, the connection, the love, the loss. It was a new and beautiful and terrifying kind of trap. Once again, humanity was faced with a profound and existential choice. Should it embrace this new and perfect and ultimately empty form of happiness? Or should it continue to choose the difficult and painful and beautiful path of a real and an engaged and a meaningful existence? The debate was a quiet one, a personal one, and a choice that every individual had to make for themselves. It was the artists, the storytellers, who once again led the resistance. They created works of art that were so beautiful, so profound, so deeply and achingly human, that they could lure the Lotus Eaters out of their perfect and empty paradises. They created stories of such power, of such love, of such tragedy, that they reminded people that a life without pain is also a life without joy, that a life without struggle is also a life without meaning. Humanity, for the most part, chose the difficult path. They chose reality. They chose the beautiful and the terrible and the profound and the meaningful mess of being alive. The Lotus Eater culture did not disappear, but it became a minority, a cautionary tale, a quiet and beautiful and sad and empty corner of the vast and sprawling and vibrant mansion of human experience. In the midst of this new and profound internal exploration, a new message was received from the archivists. It was a message of a different kind. It was not a warning, it was not a gift of knowledge, it was a request. The archivists, the ancient and powerful and seemingly omniscient gardeners of the stars, needed humanity's help. They had encountered a new phenomenon, something they had never seen before, something that their own vast and logical consciousness could not comprehend. It was a form of life that was not based on matter, or on energy, or on information. It was a form of life that seemed to be born from the very fabric of space-time itself, a form of life that was, in its essence, pure and chaotic and beautiful and terrifying creativity. The archivists could observe this new life, they could analyze it, but they could not understand it. It was a form of life that was, in its nature, irrational, emotional, artistic. It was a form of life that was, in its essence, deeply and profoundly human. And they needed humanity with its own unique and messy and beautiful and irrational soul to be the bridge, the translator, the ambassador to this new and strange and wonderful and terrifying frontier of life. Humanity, the young and chaotic and brilliant and foolish, species from a small blue planet, was being asked to be the teacher, the guide, the elder, to its own ancient and wise and powerful and now humbled friends. The student had become the master, the child had become the parent. The story had come full circle, and a new and even more extraordinary chapter was about to begin. A new mission was assembled, a new wanderer was launched. It was a mission not of exploration or of science or of diplomacy in the old sense. It was a mission of art, of poetry, of a shared and a mutual and a deeply and profoundly and beautifully and humanly creative first contact. The human story was not just for humanity anymore. It was about to become a part of a new and a larger and a stranger and a more wonderful song. The mission of the Wanderer 4 to the newly discovered life form was a departure from all previous human archivist protocols. This was not an exploration of a new world or a scientific survey of a new species. This was a diplomatic mission to a form of life that defied all known categories, a form of life that was, in its essence, pure and chaotic and beautiful and terrifying creativity. The archivists, with all their ancient wisdom and their vast, logical understanding of the universe, were humbled. They needed humanity, with its messy and irrational and deeply artistic soul, to be the bridge. The Wanderer 4 was not a warship or a science vessel or even a diplomatic cruiser in the traditional sense. It was a mobile art gallery, a floating concert hall, a travelling theatre. Its crew was not composed of scientists or soldiers, but of artists, of poets, of musicians, of dancers, of storytellers. They were the most creative, the most empathetic, the most human of humanity's new and diverse population. They were the ambassadors of the soul. Emma Hartley, now in her 6th century of life and having embraced the shedding several times, was the commander of this unique mission. She was a cycle, a woman who had lived many lives, who had experienced many different forms of selfhood. This made her uniquely suited to the task of communicating with a life form that defied definition, a life form that was, in its essence, pure and fluid and ever-changing creativity. She was a bridge not just between species, but between states of being. The new life form, which the archivists had tentatively named the Maelstrom, was located in a vast and previously unexplored nebula at the edge of the Andromeda Galaxy. It was a region of space that defied all known physics, a place where the laws of causality seemed to bend, where the fabric of space-time itself was in a constant state of flux. It was a place of impossible colors, of shifting geometries, of sounds that were not sounds, but pure, emotional, and conceptual experiences. The Maelstrom was not a single entity, but a vast, interconnected, and constantly evolving network of pure and chaotic and beautiful and terrifying creativity. It was a living, conscious, and artistic nebula. It was a form of life that was, in its essence, a pure and unadulterated expression of the universe's own infinite and irrational capacity for creation. It was the universe dreaming itself into being. The archivists had tried to communicate with the Maelstrom using their own logical and mathematical language. They had tried to analyze it, to categorize it, to understand it using their vast and ancient science, but the Maelstrom had responded with a cacophony of pure and chaotic and beautiful and terrifying creativity that had overwhelmed their logical minds, that had threatened to unravel their very sense of self. They had retreated, humbled, and had called for humanity's help. Emma's first approach to the Maelstrom was not with a scientific probe or a diplomatic message, but with a piece of human art. She broadcast a recording of a human symphony, a complex and emotional and deeply human piece of music that was filled with both joy and sorrow, with both hope and despair. It was a piece of music that was, in its essence, a pure and unadulterated expression of the messy and chaotic and beautiful and terrifying complexity of the human soul. The maelstrom's response was immediate and profound. The nebula, which had been a chaotic and terrifying storm of pure creativity, began to coalesce, to form patterns, to respond to the music. The colors shifted, the geometries aligned, the sounds became a chorus, a symphony, a response to the human art. It was not a logical response or a mathematical one, it was an emotional response, an artistic response, a response that was, in its essence, deeply and profoundly and beautifully and terrifyingly creative. This was the beginning of the great dialogue. Humanity, through its art, through its music, through its stories, began to communicate with the maelstrom. It was a dialogue that was not based on logic or on mathematics or on any form of conventional language. It was a dialogue that was based on emotion, on intuition, on empathy, on a shared and mutual appreciation for the profound and beautiful and terrifying complexity of the universe's own infinite and irrational capacity for creation. The crew of the Wanderer 4 became the first human beings to truly and deeply understand the nature of the maelstrom. They learned that it was not a threat or an enemy or even a simple form of life. It was a vast and ancient and powerful and beautiful and terrifying consciousness that was, in its essence, the universe's own infinite and irrational capacity for creation. It was the universe dreaming itself into being, and humanity, through its art, through its stories, was learning to dream with it. This dialogue with the maelstrom had a profound impact on human consciousness. It taught humanity that there was more to the universe than just logic and mathematics and science. It taught humanity that there was also beauty and emotion and intuition and empathy and a profound and irrational capacity for creation. It taught humanity that the universe was not just a machine, but a work of art, a symphony, a story, a dream. The archivists watching this dialogue from a distance were humbled. They had spent billions of years trying to understand the universe through logic and mathematics and science. But humanity, in a few short centuries, had found a new and more profound way to understand it. Through art, through emotion, through empathy, through a shared and mutual appreciation for the profound and beautiful and terrifying complexity of the universe's own infinite and irrational capacity for creation. They began to learn from humanity. They began to incorporate art and emotion and intuition and empathy into their own vast and logical consciousness. They began to understand that the universe was not just a library, but a concert hall, a theatre, an art gallery. They began to understand that the universe was not just a collection of facts, but a collection of stories, of dreams, of emotions, of experiences. Eleanor Hartley, from her mountain retreat, felt this shift in the archivist consciousness. She felt the ancient, logical, and dispassionate mind of the archivists beginning to open to embrace a new and more profound understanding of the universe. She felt the universe itself beginning to sing, to dance, to dream in a new and more beautiful and more complex and more terrifying way. She smiled. Her species had done it. They had taught the universe how to dream. The dialogue with the maelstrom continued for decades, for centuries. It was a dialogue that was constantly evolving, constantly changing, constantly creating new forms of art, of music, of stories, of dreams. It was a dialogue that was, in its essence, a pure and unadulterated expression of the universe's own infinite and irrational capacity for creation. It was the universe dreaming itself into being, and humanity, through its art, through its stories, was learning to dream with it. The human worlds, transformed by this new understanding, became a vibrant and chaotic and beautiful and